Rowan. A complete account of the Silent City. Its people, its history, its politics, and its secrets. By Glorious Knowledge Seeker. Being the 7th volume of An Honest Accounting of the Flaking Realms. Complaints may be directed to the Queen's Chambers of the Wet-Shelled Empire. Southern Draconic Continent. I am told the rubble is quite receptive. A note on content: this volume contains detailed accounts of institutionalized cruelty, the treatment of children in a manner that reasonable people will find deeply disturbing, and material that certain governments would prefer remained unexamined. Where content is particularly explicit, it will be preceded by a warning printed in red ink. The author recommends reading it anyway. That discomfort is precisely the point. Contents. Foreword. Why this book exists on methods, sources, and the Wet-Shelled Empire. On my methods, including a note on King Litharis. What you will find here: a guide to the guide. Part 1, the ground beneath your feet. Chapter 1, the city that came before, the clatter and what it was. Chapter 2, the silence descends, the attacks and their aftermath. Chapter 3, the wizard and the flowers, Caran Vane, the flower-born and years underground. Chapter 4, resettlement and the first fractures, Marin Var and the sound wardens. Chapter 5, Quandia, her rise, her reforms, and what she built. Chapter 6, Gir Salyund and what he built, the blooming party and its legacy. Chapter 7, the curse of artifice, a pattern worth examining. Part 2, the people. Chapter 8, the flower-born biology, grief culture, and the lifespan question. Chapter 9, the mixed, the city's majority, its economy, and the compatibility question. Chapter 10, the common folk, 2,000 people performing belonging. Part 3, the architecture of power. Chapter 11, the deliberation circle, how it works and what it does not fix. Chapter 12, the blooming party, a fair accounting. Chapter 13, the opposition, the together party and the communication party. Chapter 14, the sound wardens, what Marin Var built and what it became. Chapter 15, the guard structure, 4 tiers and what they mean. Part 4, the places. Chapter 16, arriving and moving through the city, the waterways, the towers, and the mind-blank incident. Chapter 17, the Quandia Conservatory of Mind and Matter, the Andia Halls. Chapter 18, the Temple of the Open Mind, all 5 sections. Chapter 19, the Covered Lantern, the only place in the city where you can be. Chapter 20, the Flower-born District, what the fence keeps out and what was found inside. Chapter 21, the city as a whole, what 2 months of walking does. Part 5, the Silent Plains. Chapter 22, the plains themselves, the landscape, the rivers, and the hermit. Chapter 23, the creatures observed, documented, and questioned. Chapter 24, what happens to the children, a full account. Interlude, a direct address to the reader, on what is being withheld and why. Chapter 25, the people who left, diaspora accounts from the surrounding region. Part 6, living with it. Chapter 26, what 2 months does to a person, a personal account. Chapter 27, the final accounting, the honest assessment. Chapter 28, an unfinished note, what remains. Foreword. Why this book exists. My 7th volume in this series was not, originally, going to be about Rowan. The plan, such as it was, involved the salt markets of the Dredge Coast and a detailed accounting of the political situation along the northern trade routes, a subject I had been gathering notes on for the better part of 2 years, and which I maintain would have made for perfectly respectable reading. Then I visited Rowan for the first time, stayed for a week, and left with my notes in considerable disorder and the distinct sense that I had seen the surface of something whose depths I had not yet found. The salt markets can wait. They will still be corrupt next year. I returned to Rowan for a second visit of 2 months, the majority of which I spent establishing interviews with residents across all 3 of the city's population groups, conducting research in locations I will not specify in order to protect certain parties, and also because specifying them would be tiresome to explain, and traveling the surrounding region to speak with those in neighboring city-states whose opinions on Rowan are formed at a careful diplomatic distance. I spent an additional 2 weeks tracking down flower-born individuals who had left the city, a group, I discovered, more numerous and more scattered than Rowan's current population figures would suggest, and gathering their perspectives on what the place they came from actually is versus what it presents itself as being. What follows is the most complete account of Rowan that exists in print. I say this not from vanity, but from simple arithmetic. No one else has looked at this place this carefully, and the people who know it best have very good reasons not to write it down. I have somewhat fewer reasons for restraint, and those I have chosen to largely disregard in the interest of giving my readers an honest account. On my methods, I am occasionally asked, in the careful phrasing of people who are trying not to say something directly, whether my methods of research are entirely above board. I find this question charming in its optimism. The truthful answer is that they are above some boards. The boards in question tend to belong to institutions with something to hide, governments with something to protect, or powerful individuals with a vested interest in the world believing a version of events that happens to flatter them. I have made my peace with this. If the alternative is a politely incomplete account dressed in the clothing of respectability, I would rather be honest about my methods and honest about what they uncovered than respectable and silent about both. In the case of Rowan specifically, a city run by psychics who are professionally equipped to detect deception and read intent at range, my methods required somewhat more preparation than usual. I will say that I arrived for my second visit considerably better equipped than my first, that certain spells of a divination and translocation nature proved invaluable, and that the city's research facilities have excellent record-keeping that is, it turns out, not quite as secure as the people maintaining those records believe it to be. For those who find this objectionable, I direct your complaints to the Queen's Chambers of the Wet-Shelled Empire, Southern Draconic Continent, as noted on the preceding page. For those specifically aggrieved on behalf of King Litharis of the Olorantha Wood Elves, whose previous displeasure with my work on his kingdom resulted in what I am told is still an active bounty on my head, I would like to extend my warmest regards and note that his treasury, however diminished by the adventuring parties my last volume inadvertently directed his way, was presumably sufficient to fund the bounty. I wish him all the best with the corruption inquiry. I understand it is ongoing. My sources in this volume include named individuals who consented to be identified, anonymous individuals whose protection I take seriously, and will not compromise regardless of what is offered or threatened, written records obtained through means already alluded to, and my own extended observation of a city that, for all its psychic acuity, cannot read the mind of someone it does not know is present. The interviews are real. The accounts are real. Where I speculate, I say so, and where I draw conclusions, I show my working. What you will find here. This book is organized into 6 parts. The first covers the history of Rowan in full, not the version the city tells about itself in civic ceremonies and school curricula, but the version that emerges when you cross-reference multiple sources, including some the city would prefer I had not accessed. There are things in the history of this place that its current residents do not know, and a few things that its researchers know and have chosen not to share. I have thoughts on both. The second part covers the people, flower-born, mixed, and common folk, in the detail that each group deserves. The flower-born chapter includes observations about their biology that I find worth raising, because certain aspects of it read, to someone who has spent sufficient time examining it, as less than entirely natural. I do not have a complete answer. I have enough of one to find it worth raising. The third part covers the politics with the directness they warrant. The fourth covers the locations in full detail. The fifth covers the silent plains and the practice that I expect will generate the most response from readers, the sending of 5-year-old children into creature-filled wilderness as a test of psychic ability. I have written about this with the precision it requires rather than the softening it does not deserve. The sixth part is my own. It is where I tell you what I actually think, having spent 2 months inside this place and 2 weeks chasing its diaspora across the Flaking Realms. A note on the city itself. Rowan is genuinely beautiful. I do not mean this as a concession or a qualification. I mean it plainly. The streets are unlike any I have walked. The people who live there carry themselves with a grace that comes from a community so deeply known to itself that performance becomes unnecessary. The lights that rise above the flower-born district when someone is lost are among the most affecting things I have seen in 40 years of travel. The Temple of the Open Mind contains a room whose light I still think about. The covered lantern serves a tea that I would travel a considerable distance to drink again. None of this makes what else is true about Rowan less true. Both things exist in the same city, in the same streets, at the same time. The beauty is real and the cruelty is real, and the people who perpetrate the cruelty largely experience themselves as the good and reasonable inheritors of a difficult history doing what is necessary to protect something precious. That is, in my experience, how most cruelty sustains itself, not through monsters, but through people who have excellent reasons. I have tried to hold all of this at once in what follows. Whether I have succeeded, I leave to you. The truth does not require your permission to exist. It only requires someone willing to write it down. Glorious knowledge seeker. Somewhere in the Flaking Realms. Precise location withheld, for the usual reasons. Part 1. The ground beneath your feet. History in most cities is something that happened elsewhere and is commemorated with a statue. In Rowan, history is something that happened underneath where you are standing and is commemorated with silence. The difference matters. What follows is the most complete account of Rowan's origins and political development that has been assembled in a single document. It draws on civic records, oral histories collected from residents across all 3 population groups, written materials obtained through research visits of varying degrees of official sanction, and the accounts of flower-born individuals who have left the city and are therefore free to speak about it with a candor that those still living within its borders generally cannot afford. Where sources conflict, I have noted it. Where I have drawn conclusions from incomplete evidence, I have said so. Where the city's official account diverges from what the evidence suggests actually happened, I have given both versions and left the reader to form their own judgment. That said, I will note that the city's official account diverges from the evidence rather more than civic pride would prefer. Chapter 1. The city that came before. Before Rowan, there was the clatter. This is what the people of Rowan call the ruins of the city that preceded theirs, a single contemptuous word that reduces an entire civilization to the quality of noise it produced. The name was not officially designated. It emerged organically from common speech sometime in the early decades of resettlement, and the fact that it stuck, that no one in the city's long history of civic organization saw fit to replace it with something more neutral, tells you something about how Rowan chooses to remember what came before it. Not with grief, not with complexity, with a dismissive syllable. I will use the name the clatter because it is what the sources use, and because inventing an alternative would be its own form of revisionism. But I want to register, at the outset, that a civilization of approximately 40,000 people that stood for at least 2 centuries deserves more than a word that means noise. What the clatter was. The clatter was a city of makers. Its most celebrated citizens were artificers, engineers, crafters, inventors, and the culture that grew up around them valued ingenuity above almost everything else. The ruins that have been excavated and studied, primarily by researchers from the Quandia Conservatory, though the work remains ongoing, suggest a city in the midst of genuine acceleration at the time of its end. The warforged they produced were sophisticated by any standard. Their clockwork mechanisms showed an understanding of interlocking systems that contemporary engineers find instructive. Their architecture, what survives of it beneath Rowan's foundations, shows the marks of a society building for permanence. Thick walls, deep foundations, structures designed to last. They had workshops on every street. They had guilds for every craft. They had, by all available evidence, a population that was largely employed, largely fed, and largely occupied with the business of making things better than they had been before. The accounts that survive from the underground period describe a city with a particular quality of sound to it. Constant, layered, the hum and click and rhythm of 1,000 projects in various stages of completion. People who grew up in it found it unremarkable. People who encountered it from outside apparently found it extraordinary. The Flaking Realms has, in the intervening centuries, developed a strong cultural consensus that this was a foolish way to live. The curse of artifice is cited regularly in discussions of the Clatter. The understanding that civilizations which pursue artificial creation and mechanical ingenuity tend to meet catastrophic ends, that there is something in the nature of that pursuit which invites disaster. I have heard the Clatter described in Rowan as reckless, as arrogant, as a civilization that got what was coming to it. Personal note, I have found in 40 years of travel that civilizations tend to describe the failures of their predecessors in terms that conveniently justify their own arrangements. Row, Anne's arrangement requires silence and psychic conformity. It is therefore useful that the civilization it replaced is remembered as having been destroyed by noise and the refusal to conform. I note this not to defend the Clatter, whose end was genuinely catastrophic, but to suggest that the story a city tells about its own history is not always the most reliable guide to what actually happened. What the ruins tell us. The excavated sections of the Clatter beneath Rowan's northern quarter have yielded a substantial archive of physical evidence. Warforged frames, some intact enough to study in detail. Tool sets of remarkable quality. Partial records written on materials that survived better than paper, clay tablets, metal-pressed sheets, carved architectural elements. From these and from the oral histories, certain things can be established with reasonable confidence. The Clatter had no flying vessels of any kind. This is worth noting because several popular accounts of the era have romanticized its technological achievements into territory the evidence does not support. What they had was sophisticated ground-level engineering and a genuine talent for mechanical creatures. Their Warforged were their greatest achievement and their most visible one, and it was the Warforged that the creatures destroyed first when they came. The city had a governing council weighted toward guild leadership. The artificer guilds especially held significant political power, with some representation for merchant and residential communities. There is no evidence of any psychic component to governance. Decisions were made through spoken deliberation, recorded by scribes, and enacted through appointed administrators. It was, by all accounts, a loud process. The population at the time of the attacks is estimated at between 35 and 45,000. Of those, somewhere between 6 and 8,000 survived the initial weeks of the creature attacks. Fewer than 4,000 made it underground. The rest are not accounted for in any record that has survived. A civilization is not its worst moment, but its worst moment is, often, all that remains of it. Chapter 2. The silence descends. The creatures arrived without warning. This statement requires some qualification. There were, in the weeks before the attacks began in earnest, isolated incidents that survivors later identified as early signs. Warforged units returning damaged from perimeter patrols. A section of workshop district that went uncharacteristically quiet one evening and was found, the following morning, to have had every mechanical device within it dismantled or destroyed. A clockmaker in the eastern quarter who reported. 3 days before the main attack, that something had taken apart his entire workshop overnight without disturbing the walls or the locks. These incidents were investigated and not explained. They were not connected. The Clatter did not have the benefit of hindsight. The main attack, as best as can be reconstructed from survivor accounts, began on an unremarkable morning in what would have been the middle of the working week. The creatures, invisible to the naked eye, drawn entirely to sound, entered the city from multiple directions simultaneously. The first casualties were the Warforged on perimeter duty, then the Warforged throughout the city, then every mechanical device of sufficient complexity to produce consistent noise. Clocks, looms, forge bellows. Grinding wheels. Each one dismantled or destroyed within hours of the attack's beginning, the creatures moving through walls and doors and any gap wide enough to admit them. The first days. The human population's experience of the first days was one of escalating incomprehension. The creatures were invisible. They produced no sound themselves. The only evidence of their presence was the destruction they left behind and the deaths of those who were too loud or too slow to understand what was happening. Early accounts describe people calling out to each other in the streets, shouting for information, for help, for explanation, and dying for it. The creatures responded to voice with the same efficiency they applied to machinery. Those who survived the first days did so through a combination of instinct, luck, and in some cases a cold-blooded willingness to stay quiet while people around them were dying loudly. Survivor accounts are consistent on this point and largely unsentimental about it. The people who made it through the first week were people who understood, quickly, that noise was death, and who acted on that understanding regardless of what it cost them in the moment. Within 3 days, the workshops were silent. Within a week, the Warforged were gone. Every unit in the city either destroyed outright or dismantled while attempting to continue operating. The city's primary labor force, its most celebrated technological achievement, was eliminated in 7 days. The population that remained was hiding in upper floors and interior rooms, communicating in whispers when they communicated at all, and trying to determine what was happening to them and whether it was going to stop. It did not stop. The weeks that followed, the creatures did not leave once the city's machinery was destroyed. They remained, patrolling through walls and floors and any space they could perceive, responding to any sound above a certain threshold with immediate and lethal precision. The surviving population's options narrowed rapidly. Food stores were finite. Water required movement to access, and movement produced sound. Communication beyond immediate proximity was effectively impossible. What emerged in these weeks, among the people who survived them, was a particular kind of social order, one built entirely around the management of noise. Communities of survivors developed hand signals, touch-based communication, systems of shared understanding that required no sound whatsoever. The accounts suggest this happened independently in multiple locations across the city before any of these groups found each other. Humans, when survival requires it, adapt their communication faster than most would expect. The death toll across the first month is estimated, with significant uncertainty, at somewhere between 20 and 25,000 people. The majority of these deaths occurred in the first 2 weeks. By the end of the first month, the survivors, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 individuals, had largely gone underground, accessing the tunnel and cavern systems beneath the city that the Clatter's construction had incidentally created. The surface city was effectively abandoned. The oral histories from this period are among the most striking documents I encountered during my research. They are spare and factual in a way that I initially attributed to the nature of oral transmission, details smoothed away by decades of retelling. I have since come to believe that the spareness was original. The people who lived through this did not have the language for it because nothing in their experience had prepared them to describe it. They recorded what happened. They did not editorialize. I have tried to follow their example in this chapter. Chapter 3. The Wizard and the Flowers. His name was Caran Vane. This is not something the city of Rowan knows with certainty. His name does not appear in any official civic record, which is unsurprising given that official civic records were not being kept in any organized fashion during the period of his greatest activity. It appears in oral histories, consistently, across multiple independent lines of transmission, which is the closest thing to verification available for a man who died long enough ago that no living person has any direct connection to him. Caran Vane, a wizard of apparently considerable power who was present in the Clatter at the time of the attacks, and who, in the weeks following the initial catastrophe, became the organizing intelligence behind the survivors' response. What he was doing in the Clatter before the attacks is not recorded. He was not a citizen of the city, this much the accounts agree on. He was a visitor, or passing through, or conducting research of his own. Several accounts describe him as already being familiar with the tunnel systems beneath the city before the survivors retreated into them, which suggests he had been in the area for some time. Beyond this, the record does not go. The discovery below. It was Caran Vane who led the largest group of survivors into the tunnel system, and it was Caran Vane who knew, or discovered, what was living there. The psychic plants had occupied the cavern network beneath the clatter for an unknown period before the attacks. They were sentient. This is not a retrospective attribution based on what they later became, but something that the survivors recognized relatively quickly from the nature of the warnings the plants communicated. When danger was near, the plants sent out psychic pulses that caused the people sheltering near them to feel a distinct and directional sense of threat. They would contract into the earth when the creatures passed through the tunnels above. They were aware of their environment in ways that went beyond the sensory capacity of ordinary plants, and they communicated that awareness with a precision that the survivors learned to read and trust. The plants had no language. They had no individual names. They communicated in impressions and directional feelings and a form of shared awareness that the survivors experienced as a presence rather than a voice. What they communicated most consistently in those early months was a profound and unhurried calm. They had been underground a long time. They had known the creatures or things like them before. They were not afraid. Karan Vane spent a significant period studying the plants before he attempted what came next. Accounts differ on exactly how long. Estimates range from several weeks to several months. But the accounts agree that he was thorough, that he asked the plants' consent through whatever means of communication was available to him, and that the plants agreed. The transformation. The spell Karan Vane used to transform the plants into humanoid beings was, by any measure, one of the most significant acts of magic recorded in the history of the Flaking Realms. It was also ruinously expensive. Each casting cost an estimated 25 platinum pieces in materials and components, and he cast it approximately 400 times over the course of the 48 years that followed. The total expenditure, roughly 10,000 platinum, required the survivors to organize raiding parties to the surface and to neighboring areas simply to fund continued castings. People went into creature-patrolled territory carrying packs and came back with whatever valuables they could gather quietly. Some did not come back. The beings that emerged from the transformations had luminous light blue hair that seemed to carry its own faint illumination and eyes of warm, steady gold. They retained the psychic capacities of the plants they had been, refined and extended by their new humanoid form. They could sense the creatures at distances that far exceeded any human perceptual capacity. They could communicate psychically with precision and range. They could, critically, locate and attack the creatures without making any sound that would reveal their position. They were, in the specific and terrible context of the war being fought underground, exactly what the survivors needed. They also had souls. This point will become relevant, and I will return to it. The Saris comparison. I have, in the course of my travels, encountered one other instance of a mortal practitioner creating humanoid beings through magical means on a comparable scale. Saris, who rules the ice city in the northern draconic continent, and whose glacians I have written about at length elsewhere, created her people through original construction rather than transformation, building humanoid forms from raw magical material rather than reshaping existing beings. Her glacians are remarkable creatures, beautiful, capable, uniquely suited to the frozen environment they inhabit, and entirely without souls. This is not Saris's intention. She would prefer otherwise. It appears to be a fundamental limitation of mortal creation. You can make a being, but you cannot make the thing that makes it a person in the deepest sense. What Karan Vane did was different, and the difference appears to matter. He did not create the flower-born. He changed them. The plants were already sentient, already possessed of whatever quality grants a being an inner life. The transformation altered their form without, apparently, touching whatever it is that makes a soul a soul. The flower-born emerged from the process as people, different people than they had been, shaped differently, experiencing the world through entirely new senses, but people nonetheless, with continuity of self that Saris's glacians demonstrably lack. I find this curious in ways I cannot entirely articulate. The question of what Karan Vane understood about this distinction, whether he knew he was preserving something that Saris could not create, whether it informed his decision to transform rather than create, is one the record does not answer. I would very much like to know. I would also very much like to know why the beings he transformed have a lifespan of 30 years, significantly shorter than the humans they came to live alongside and shorter by a considerable margin than the plants they were before, which appear from the botanical record to have been potentially quite long-lived. I do not have an answer to this question. I have noted it here because I believe it deserves noting, and I will return to it in Part 2. 48 years underground. The underground period lasted 48 years. This is a long time by any measure, and particularly long measured against the flower-born lifespan. The original transformed plants who fought alongside the human survivors were almost entirely gone before the war ended, their 30-year lives spent entirely in the service of a conflict that outlasted them. Their children remained. The children of some of the earliest transformations were fighting in the final years. The society that developed underground during this period was, of necessity, radically different from the one that had existed above. Noise was still death. The creatures patrolled the tunnels and responded to sound with the same lethal efficiency they had shown on the surface. Communication was psychic or gestural. Commerce was cooperative. The human survivors who thrived were those who adapted most thoroughly to the conditions, and the conditions selected, consistently, for people who were calm, quiet, controlled, and capable of sustained coordination without verbal communication. The interbreeding between transformed flower-born and human survivors began as a practical matter. The transformation spell was unsustainable at its current cost, and the population needed to find another way to produce psychic individuals capable of fighting. The children of these unions had light blue hair and golden eyes and varying degrees of psychic capacity. Karan Vane trained them. He sent them up to fight. They were, by multiple accounts, exceptionally good at it. By the time the last of the creatures within and beneath the city were purged, a process that took the full 48 years, and was never a clean victory so much as a gradual and grinding reduction. The population underground had grown to something in the range of 15,000, predominantly psychic, predominantly mixed heritage, and thoroughly adapted to a life without noise. The surface city waited for them. Chapter 4. Resettlement and the First Fractures. The return to the surface was not the triumphant reclamation that civic ceremony has subsequently made of it. It was, by the accounts of those who lived it, an extended and frequently painful process of discovering that the world they had prepared to reclaim was not the world that greeted them. The surface city had not been maintained. 48 years of abandonment had done what 48 years of abandonment does. The clatter's remaining structures had deteriorated, been further dismantled by the creatures, and in several areas collapsed entirely. The soft white tiles that now define Rowan's streets did not yet exist. What existed was rubble and ruin, and the remnants of a city that had been destroyed twice over, first by the creatures and then by time. The flower-born, emerging into open air and daylight for the first time in their lives, many of the younger ones had been born underground and had never seen the sky, found the surface world overwhelming in ways that were not immediately obvious to the human survivors alongside them. Sound behaved differently above ground. It carried further. The ambient noise of wind and open space, negligible to human perception, registered to flower-born senses with an acuity that made the early weeks of resettlement genuinely difficult for many of them. Then the common folk started arriving. The noise returns. Word spread, as word does, that the city was safe. People from surrounding areas began moving in, drawn by the available space, the location, and the general human tendency to settle where others have settled before. These newcomers brought with them the full complement of sounds that ordinary life produces: conversation, children, commerce, livestock, the general productive noise of a population going about its business. The flower-born could not bear it. This is not metaphorical. The physical sensitivity that made them extraordinary fighters and navigators in the silence of the underground war made them genuinely vulnerable to the ambient noise of normal urban life. Accounts from the early resettlement period describe flower-born individuals collapsing in crowded areas, experiencing debilitating headaches that lasted days, becoming unable to function in districts where multiple conversations were happening simultaneously. The mixed heritage population fared somewhat better, but not entirely well. The city they had fought to reclaim was, in its natural state, actively hostile to the people who had done most of the fighting. The physical modifications that now define Rowan's streets, the soft-tiled floors, the cloth-wrapped cartwheels, the architectural choices that minimize echo and reverberation, were developed in this period as pragmatic responses to immediate suffering rather than aesthetic preferences. They solved part of the problem. They did not solve the part that came from having thousands of people who had not been underground now living alongside thousands who had. Marin Var and the Sound Wardens. Marin Var was 63 years old when he established the Sound Wardens, which makes him one of the older survivors of the underground period, and one of the few people in the city's early governance who had clear memories of the clatter before the attacks. He had been a craftsman there, a carpenter, specifically, one of the quieter trades, and had survived the initial attacks through a combination of the instincts his work had given him and the particular fortune of being in an interior room with good walls when the creatures first arrived. He was not a psychic. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man of considerable practical intelligence and genuine community feeling who had watched the city he loved be destroyed twice and had no intention of watching it be destroyed a third time through negligence. His proposal for the Sound Wardens was modest by the standards of what the institution later became. A group of mixed heritage individuals with strong psychic capacity who would monitor the city for disruptive noise levels and issue gentle psychic warnings to those causing them, with the secondary purpose of maintaining vigilance against any return of the creatures. He also established education centers that taught common folk residents basic psychic communication spells, understanding that the long-term solution to the noise problem was not exclusion, but integration. He died 14 years after establishing the Sound Wardens, having seen them function largely as he intended throughout his lifetime. The education centers were full. The noise complaints were declining. He died believing, with reasonable justification, that he had built something good. He had. What was built on top of it came later. The deliberation circle. The governance structure that emerged in the early resettlement period went through several iterations before arriving at the form that Rowan still uses today, substantially established by the time of Kwandia's leadership, and changed only in composition since then. The deliberation circle, the name refers both to the governing council and to the physical chamber it meets in, is an open circular room in the city's administrative quarter. The lowest level is the floor of the council itself, 20 seats for elected representatives of the general population, and 4 seats permanently designated for flower-born representatives, the latter reflecting a cultural acknowledgement of the flower-born's founding role rather than strict proportional representation. Above the council floor, rising in open tiers, is space for citizen observers. Any resident of the city may attend deliberations, and by the nature of the chamber and the psychic capacity of most of its population, may read the thoughts of any council member they choose to focus on during proceedings. The central mechanism of the circle is a raised platform at the room's center where any citizen may stand. While they stand there, every council member and every observer with the capacity reads their thoughts directly, making it effectively impossible to be dishonest about what you believe. The citizen does not address the council in spoken words. They simply stand and are known, and the council reads what they have come to say. The circle is genuinely remarkable as a deliberative mechanism, and I would be more enthusiastic about it if not for one structural feature that appears to have been present from its earliest design. The voting mechanism is psychic. Council members deliver their votes through direct psychic transmission to a designated receiver, which means that from the beginning of the circle's operation, any member of the council who could not transmit psychically could not vote. Common folk representatives, and there were some in the early years, could stand at the center, could have their thoughts read by everyone in the room. They could not, in any verified sense, cast a vote that was received and counted. Whether this was intentional design or oversight I cannot determine from the available record. I note that it was never corrected. Chapter 5. Kwandia. She was born in the 42nd year of resettlement, which made her a third-generation descendant of the underground period, close enough to the founding era to feel its weight, but far enough from it that the weight was history rather than memory. Her parents were both flower-born, which gave her a lifespan measured in decades rather than centuries, and a psychic capacity that the accounts consistently describe as exceptional, even by the standards of a city where exceptional psychic capacity was the baseline. She entered civic life in her early 20s and rose through the council with a speed that the records attribute to a combination of genuine ability and a particular quality of presence. She did not need to speak to be heard. She did not need to argue to persuade. People in her vicinity tended to understand her position with a clarity and completeness that normal communication rarely achieves, and they tended to find it reasonable even when they had not previously agreed with it. She became head of council in her 24th year and held the position for 10 years, the longest tenure of any flower-born head, and at the time of her election, the longest tenure of any head regardless of heritage. She retired at 34 with 6 years remaining in her life and spent them in the flower-born district, which she reportedly found, after a decade of navigating the noise of civic life, a relief. The crisis she inherited. By the time Kwandia came to power, the situation in Rowan had deteriorated from the manageable tension of Marin Var's era into something approaching open conflict. The education centers Var had established were operating, but underfunded and increasingly irrelevant. Many common folk residents simply did not use them. Merchants in particular were resistant, their livelihoods depending on the kind of vocal, assertive behavior that was actively harmful to flower-born residents in their vicinity. The pattern that developed was self-reinforcing in the worst possible way. Loud behavior from common folk caused flower-born to experience genuine physical pain. That pain expressed itself, in some individuals, and then in increasing numbers, as psychic retaliation, mind sliver attacks that began as reflexive responses and became, in the more extreme cases, coordinated assaults. Common folk who were attacked had no way of knowing what was happening to them and no recourse through any official channel, because the attackers were not violating any explicit rule. The response from some common folk communities was to protest loudly, which caused more flower-born to collapse, which caused more attacks. The death of a merchant in the commercial district, attacked simultaneously by multiple psychic individuals in response to his shouting, the combined force sufficient to kill, brought things to a head. Common folk communities were in open vocal protest, which was simultaneously their most natural form of expression and the most damaging thing they could do to their position in the city. Her solution. Kwandia's response to the crisis was swift, clear, and not gentle. She proposed and passed what is now referred to as the Accommodation Compact, a framework that gave common folk residents a choice between adapting to the city's communication norms within a defined period or relocating. The city would provide resources for relocation. It would provide extended access to education and apparatus for those who chose to stay. What it would not provide was an indefinite extension of tolerance for behavior that was causing its psychic residents demonstrable physical harm. The compact passed the deliberation circle with a majority that reflected both genuine community support and, it must be said, the structural disadvantage of common folk in a voting system that required psychic transmission. The common folk population of the city at the time was approximately 6,000. Most left. Those who stayed adapted. The noise levels in the city dropped. The psychic attacks became less frequent. It was, by the narrow metric of the immediate crisis, effective. Here is what I believe the record shows, and what the city's official account does not particularly emphasize. Kwandia did not set out to build an exclusionary city. Her own political identity in her earlier council years was closer to what we would now recognize as the Together Party's platform: integration over exclusion, adaptation over expulsion. She responded to a genuine emergency with the tools available to her, and the emergency receded. What she could not control was how the tools she used would be picked up by people who came after her and who did not share her intention. This is the particular tragedy of effective policy in the wrong hands. It works, and its working makes it available. Her actual legacy. the research division Kwandia established during her tenure, which became the foundation of what is now the Kwandia Conservatory of Mind and Matter, was the work she was most proud of. She believed, genuinely, that understanding psychic capacity more deeply would produce better solutions than the blunt instrument of the accommodation compact. She funded studies into the nature of psychic ability, its origins, its variations, its potential. She wanted to know why some people had it and others did not, and whether the gap was bridgeable. The researchers she set in motion are still working on these questions. Some of what they have found I have read. Some of what they have found I suspect they have chosen not to share, for reasons that I find more understandable than I find defensible. I will return to this in part 2. She is buried in the Flowerborn district. Her grave marker is, appropriately, silent. After Kwandia, the council in the middle years. The decades between Kwandia's retirement and Jir Salyun's rise to council head are not, as a period, dramatic. They are the years in which the city settled into a shape, not the extreme shape it would later take, but the general outline of it. A series of council heads served terms of 1 to 3 years each, none of them particularly notable, most of them managing rather than directing. The Blooming Party, not yet formally named as such, was the dominant political tendency in the council, cautious, conservative, oriented toward protecting what the city had rather than expanding who could be part of it. There were good years, infrastructure improved, the conservatory grew. Trade relationships with neighboring city-states stabilized into the mutual dependency that still defines regional politics. The Temple of the Open Mind expanded into its current multi-section form. By most measures, the city was prospering. There were also years in which the mood toward common folk hardened in ways that produced no single dramatic event, but accumulated into a changed atmosphere. The education centers Marinvar had built were defunded gradually, then repurposed, then closed. The apparatus system became less a welcome support and more a marker of difference. None of these changes were decreed in a single policy. They happened the way most cultural shifts happen, through many small decisions by many people, each individually defensible, collectively transformative. Chapter 6. Jir Salyun and what he built. Jir Salyun came to the council head position 8 years after a period of 1-year tenures that had, by broad consensus, produced nothing of note. He was mixed heritage, the son of a flower-born father who had died before Jir Salyun reached adulthood, and a mixed mother who had raised him with what the accounts describe as a fierce consciousness of flower-born suffering and sacrifice. He had been a council member for 6 years before his elevation. He was known as an effective presence in the circle, precise, emotionally controlled, with a particular talent for transmitting complex positions in ways that felt like common sense when received. He held the head position for 14 years. The rhetoric. What Jir Salyun understood, and what made him effective in ways that outlasted his tenure, was that the city already believed most of what he was saying. He did not invent the idea that common folk represented a threat to Rowan's way of life. He found these things already present in the city's political culture and gave them a vocabulary, a historical framework, and a moral justification that made them feel like policy rather than prejudice. His central argument was consistent across 14 years. The noise of the clatter had brought the creatures. The creatures had nearly destroyed everything. The flower-born and the mixed had rebuilt it through sacrifice that the common folk had not shared and could not fully understand. Every time a flower-born collapsed from noise exposure, every time a merchant shouted in a market, every time a traveler spoke too loudly in a street, it was a repetition of the conditions that had caused the catastrophe. He did not say common folk were bad people. He said they were people who refused to change in ways that could get everyone killed again. The distinction felt meaningful. In practice, it produced the same results. He also made heavy use of the deliberation circle's transparency in ways his predecessors had not. He would take the center platform not relying on spoken words, but projecting entirely through psychic transmission. A deliberate choice that excluded common folk observers from following his meaning without apparatus assistance, and that signaled, without statting, who he considered his real audience to be. The Secure Future Act. The legislation that defines Jirsalyun's legacy was passed in his 7th year and was framed, with characteristic precision, as a measure of community protection rather than population control. The Secure Future Act established a licensing system for parenthood. Prospective parents were tested for psychic capacity and issued formal authorization based on the results. Those without sufficient psychic ability were not prohibited from having children. They were simply not licensed to do so, with all the social and legal weight that distinction carried in a city where unlicensed activity in any domain was treated as a matter of community safety. The effect on the common folk population was immediate and severe. Many left the city rather than submit to a system that categorized their potential children as a community risk. The city's population shifted measurably within a decade. The education centers, by this point serving a dwindling population of non-psychic residents, were closed in Jirsalyun's 12th year. There was no public debate about this. His departure and its aftermath. Jirsalyun was not voted out of the council head position. He chose not to stand for re-election in his 14th year, citing health, and stepped back from active civic life. He remained a council member for 8 more years before retiring entirely. During those 8 years, he was, by multiple accounts, the most influential figure in Rowan's politics despite holding no formal leadership role. He died in his 61st year and was given a civic ceremony that the Blooming Party characterized as appropriate recognition of his contributions, and the Together Party characterized, in somewhat more muted terms, as a state celebration of a man who had done genuine harm. Both assessments are defensible. The heads who followed. The council heads who followed Jirsalyun's retirement form a sequence that I will summarize rather than catalog in full, as the complete list of 1-year and 2-year tenures runs to considerable length without adding proportionate understanding. Dravona, who came to the head position 4 years after Jirsalyun's retirement, having spent those 4 years as the most vocal champion of his predecessor's legacy, served 4 years, and is remembered primarily for the vigor with which he prosecuted the licensing system and for a significant expansion of the Sound Warden's official mandate. He was a man of limited political imagination who compensated with considerable ideological conviction. He did not move the city forward. He made sure it did not move backward from where Jirsalyun had left it. Tail Surrey, who followed Dravona after a 2-year gap of unremarkable leadership, is the most contested figure of the post-Jirsalyun era. He served 7 years and spent most of them attempting to moderate the Blooming Party's position from within. His achievements were real but limited. A partial restoration of apparatus access programs for visiting travelers, a modest expansion of the Together Party's council representation through electoral reforms that the Blooming Party subsequently reversed, and a softening of the licensing system's enforcement that lasted only until he left office. He was a genuinely decent man operating inside a system designed to resist decency, and the system largely won. Kelvoran, who succeeded Tail Surrey after a contentious election, served 8 years and was the architect of the policy that replaced the Secure Future Act's licensing system. The child testing protocol, by which children determined to lack psychic ability at age 5 are sent to the Silent Plains, was proposed during his 3rd year and passed in his 4th. I will discuss this policy in full in Part 5. I will say here only that Kelvoran did not invent the cruelty. He formalized it. Heads who followed Kelvoran have been, to varying degrees, unremarkable. None has served more than 4 years. The current head of council, Varane, is in his 3rd year and is described by every source I consulted, including his supporters, as competent and uninspiring. The city under his leadership is stable, prosperous, quiet, and entirely committed to the arrangements his predecessors built. He shows no inclination to examine those arrangements. No one in his coalition is asking him to. Chapter 7. The Curse of Artifice. I want to be careful in this chapter, because I am going to describe a pattern, and I am aware that patterns can be found in anything by a mind sufficiently determined to find them. I am also aware that I have spent 2 months in a city whose entire existence is the consequence of a catastrophe, and that proximity to catastrophe has a way of making one see catastrophe everywhere. With those caveats registered, here is what I have observed. A consistent pattern. In 40 years of travel across the Flaking Realms and beyond, I have encountered a remarkable number of civilizations whose pursuit of artifice ended in disaster. Not merely setback. Not merely the ordinary friction of a society pushing against its limits. Disaster, comprehensive, civilization-altering events that came without warning and left the survivors fundamentally changed in their relationship to the thing that preceded them. The Clatter and its creatures are the most familiar example to the people of this region. But in the course of my research for this volume and the others in this series, I have documented a city in the eastern Flaking Realms whose artificer quarter was swallowed by a sinkhole that opened across 11 days and then simply stopped. A kingdom 2 centuries ago that pursued mechanical weaponry and experienced a plague that moved through its engineer population with a specificity that natural disease does not generally manage. Flooding that targeted. With implausible precision, the workshop districts of a river city while leaving residential areas largely intact. Earthquakes in the northern provinces that lasted weeks and centered on the location of a large-scale mechanical project that was, at the time of the quakes, within months of completion. The locals in each case have explanations. Most of them involve the curse of artifice, the widely held understanding in the Flaking Realms that there is something dangerous in the pursuit of artificial creation, something that attracts consequences. This is treated as a fact of the natural world, the way flooding is a fact and disease is a fact. It is not generally treated as something that requires further explanation. What I notice that the disasters are varied. Floods, earthquakes, creatures, plagues, the mechanism changes, but the target is consistent. Civilizations pursuing artifice, specifically at moments of significant acceleration, experience catastrophic interruption. I notice that the survivors in each case rebuild differently. Not randomly differently. Specifically differently, in ways that move away from artificial creation and toward either psychic capacity, divine connection, martial tradition, or some other form of power that does not involve the mechanical manipulation of the physical world. As though the disaster did not merely stop a specific project, but redirected an entire civilization's relationship with power. I noticed that the Flaking Realms has a higher concentration of these events than any other region I have studied. I do not know what any of this means. I'm a travel writer with an unusually broad research base and a tendency to notice things that do not quite fit the official explanation. What I am is honest, and honesty requires me to say, the pattern is there, it is consistent enough to be worth taking seriously, and the explanation that it is simply the natural consequence of dangerous pursuits does not, to my eye, fully account for what I have seen. Someone who wanted to stop civilizations from pursuing artifice, and who had the power and patience to act across centuries and across a region, could produce exactly the pattern I have described. I am not saying this is what happened. I am saying I cannot rule it out, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about it. I submitted this chapter to a colleague whose judgment I trust before including it in this volume. They told me it was the most likely section of the book to get me killed, and asked whether I wanted to reconsider. I told them I had already survived one king's bounty and found the process character building. The chapter stays. History is not what happened. It is what survived the telling. End of Part 1. Part 2. The people. History produces people. This is obvious and also easy to forget when you are reading about events rather than sitting across from the individuals those events shaped. Part 1 of this volume covered what happened to Rowan over 2 centuries of survival, politics, and gradual calcification. Part 2 covers who is living inside the result. The interviews in this section were conducted over the course of my 2-month stay, primarily in the lower level of the covered lantern, whose proprietors were generous enough to make their padded room available for extended use during my research. I owe them more than a line of thanks, and am giving them one anyway. Several of the softer-spoken flower-born sources I spoke with would not have been audible to me or frankly comfortable enough to finish their thoughts without that room. It did genuine work. A note on the honesty of my sources. Psychics, as a general population, do not lie well. This is not a moral observation. It is a developmental one. Children who grow up in a society where everyone around them can read surface thoughts and probe deeper if motivated to do so simply do not develop the practiced deception that most people carry into adulthood. What I found in my interviews, consistently, was a population that communicated what they actually believed. I have reproduced their words as accurately as I can. Any errors of translation are mine. Chapter 8. The Flowerborn. Spending extended time with the Flowerborn is an experience that is difficult to describe to someone who has not had it, and I have been trying to describe things to people who have not had them for 40 years. So I want to be clear that this is a genuine difficulty rather than false modesty. It is not that they are alien. It is that they are present in a way that most people are not. When a Flowerborn is talking to you, they are entirely talking to you, not composing their next sentence while you finish yours, not managing their expression for effect, not holding any part of their attention in reserve. Their focus is complete and unperformed because performance, for a people who grew up reading and being read, is simply not a habit they developed. You feel it as attention. You feel it as being genuinely seen. It is, unexpectedly, one of the more affecting experiences the city has to offer, and it costs nothing and requires no appointment. The biology of a short life. The Flowerborn mature at approximately twice the rate of humans. A Flowerborn of 10 years is, in physical and cognitive development, comparable to a human of 20. Their blooming periods, seasonal cycles during which fertility is dramatically elevated, and pregnancy lasts approximately 2 months, occur roughly once a year, and represent the primary mechanism by which their population reproduces. A Flowerborn who chooses to have children can have many. Most do not. This is the detail about Flowerborn society that surprises outsiders most consistently. In a population with a 30-year lifespan, one might expect reproduction to be treated as urgent, a demographic imperative. The Flowerborn do not experience it this way. Roughly 1 in 7 or 8 individuals has a family at all, and those who do tend to come to it late in their lives, after the ambition that defines their earlier years has either been satisfied or has simply run its course. The majority spend their decades in focused, single-minded pursuit of something, a research project, a political goal, a creative work, and die in that pursuit or having completed it without children, without apparent regret. The population figures bear this out. 2 centuries of Flowerborn existence in Rowan has produced a current population of approximately 14,500, a slow accumulation that reflects the genuine rate at which a people who mostly choose ambition over reproduction actually grow. There is no cultural pressure toward family. There is no stigma attached to dying childless. The Flowerborn relationship with legacy is expressed through work and through the city they help sustain, not through descendants. I am reminded, tangentially, of the Vegepimes, the moss-born peoples found in dark corners of the world, 3-month lives built from the ambitions of the dead whose remains fed them. They too are creatures of grand ambition impractically housed in brief existence. The comparison ends there. Vegepimes build little in the time they have, their ambitions too compressed to act on, while the Flowerborn have the decade or 2 necessary to actually finish things. But the parallel of ambition exceeding lifespans struck me as worth noting. The question of the lifespan. Here is what I know about the Flowerborn lifespan. It is 30 years. Here is what I find curious about it, almost everything else. The psychic plants from which the Flowerborn descend were, as best the botanical record can determine, potentially quite long-lived. Plants of similar genus and psychic capacity found in other regions of the Flaking Realms show no particular tendency toward short lifespans. The transformation performed by Caran Vane altered their form substantially. He created people from plants, which is not a small thing. But there is no obvious reason why the transformation should have produced beings who live a third, as long as the humans they came to live alongside. I have encountered one other instance of magically created humanoid beings with unusual biological parameters. Ceres, whose glacians I have written about at length elsewhere, created her people entirely from raw magical material. The glacians are beautiful and capable, and without souls, because mortal creation cannot produce the quality that makes a being a person in the deepest sense. Karan Vane transformed the plants rather than creating from nothing, and the flower-born have souls, which supports the theory that what he changed was form rather than essence. But the Glacians also have no particular compatibility restrictions. They are simply incompatible with everyone, including each other. The flower-born are compatible with humans, and apparently only humans. This is the detail I find most difficult to account for. In the course of my travels, I have studied dozens of peoples with unusual biological origins, and without exception, any people capable of producing offspring with humans have also been capable of producing offspring with halflings, close enough to humans in biological terms that the distinction rarely matters. The flower-born cannot. No recorded case of flower-born halfling offspring exists in any source I have been able to access. I do not know what produced the flower-born's specific and narrow compatibility. I do not know why their lifespan is what it is. I know that Karan Vane was a wizard of considerable power who spent significant time studying the plants before transforming them, and who had both the knowledge and the capacity to build specific parameters into the transformation if he had chosen to do so. I am not making an accusation. I am nodding a curiosity that I find persistent enough to mention, and significant enough that I intend to dedicate a future volume to the question of magically engineered peoples, and what their biologies might tell us about the intentions of those who created them. The grief culture. The light shows are the most visible expression of how the flower-born relationship with death differs from that of longer-lived peoples, but they are not the only one. Death among the flower-born is expected, planned for, and incorporated into daily life in ways that outsiders consistently describe as either beautiful or unsettling, depending on their own relationship with mortality. Flower-born do not, generally, avoid the subject of their own death. They discuss it with the matter-of-factness of people who have known the date circled on the calendar since childhood. They make arrangements early. They finish things. The ambition that drives them through their 20s is partly, multiple sources suggested to me, a product of the knowledge that the 20s are likely all they have. When a flower-born dies, the city marks it. Light, rising from the district, collective and silent and carrying a weight of meaning that does not require translation. What I did not understand until I observed one from inside the district is that these are not simply luminous displays. They are murals. Composed with precision visible only from specific angles within the district, they form images, particular, specific, planned by the person whose death they commemorate years before their passing. The flower-born work with a group of artists and friends in their final years on exactly what they want painted in the sky as their send-off. It is not mourning. It is a final act of self-expression, carefully prepared, executed after death by a community that honored the request. Interview, Fee Coors. Fee Coors, flower-born council member, age 26, spoke on record, party affiliation withheld at their request. I will tell you what I believe, and you may weigh it as you choose. I am aware that some of what I say will be used to characterize my politics. I would prefer you characterize my thoughts instead. They communicated this through psychic impression before standing at the center of our conversation. I noted it and proceeded. The city works. I know that sounds like a simple thing to say, and perhaps an insufficient one given the questions you are going to ask me, but I want you to understand what I mean by it. We do not have crime in any meaningful sense. We do not have poverty. We do not have the kind of loneliness that I am told defines life in cities where no one knows what anyone else is thinking. We have built something that functions, and it functions because the people in it are committed to the same things. That commitment required certain decisions that reasonable people disagree about. I am one of those reasonable people. On the noise, yes, people can be harsh. I will not pretend otherwise. When someone is loud in the street, it is not merely annoying. It is physical. Some of my older relatives have described it as being struck. I do not experience it as severely as they do, but I experience it. I understand the impulse to retaliate. I do not always think the retaliation is proportionate. I think that in a perfect world everyone would be psychic, or at minimum would have easy access to the development of psychic ability, so that we could all communicate with the precision and honesty that psychic communication makes possible. That world does not exist. We are building toward it as best we can. The children. You are going to ask me about the children. I will tell you that I find the practice necessary, and I will also tell you that I find it terrible, and I do not believe those two things contradict each other. We are a city that survives because of psychic capacity. The creatures in the plains are real. The danger of a city with insufficient psychic coverage is real. I would prefer we had found a gentler way to ensure that coverage. I do not know what that way is. I have thought about it for years. If you find it, please let me know. They conveyed the last sentence partly through impression rather than words. What came through was not sarcasm. It was genuine. I found that harder to sit with than sarcasm would have been. I looked into their party affiliation afterward. They are a member of the Blooming Party. I include this not to discredit what they said, there was no dishonesty in it, but because I think it matters that the Blooming Party contains people who find their own policies terrible and vote for them anyway. That is, in my experience, how most systems sustain themselves. Anonymous Flowerborn, age 29, resident of the Flowerborn district, declined to give names, spoke through the covered lantern's padded room at their request. I have 1 year left. Give or take. The healers at the temple can be more precise if I ask them. I have not asked them. I know approximately, and approximately is enough. What do I want you to write? Write that we are not sad about it. We are not performing contentment for you. We are not making peace with something painful. We grew up knowing. You grow up knowing, and it becomes the shape of things rather than a tragedy. The tragedy is when people do not know, when they believe they have unlimited time and spend it accordingly. I have never had that illusion. I think it has made me better at being alive. My family, I have 4 children. All of them psychic, all of them mixed, all of them more than I had planned for, and less time with each of them than I would have chosen. My oldest is 21. She will outlive me by decades. I have spent considerable time making sure she knows everything I know, not because I am afraid of being forgotten, but because I do not want her to have to learn it the hard way when she could learn it from me. That is the only legacy I actually care about. Everything else is flattering. You want to know about the lifespan. Everyone does, eventually. I do not know why we live as long as we do and not longer. I know that we live fully. I know that the plants we came from apparently lived longer, and I know that I am not a plant, and the comparison feels less relevant to me than it seems to feel to researchers. Maybe someone made us this way. Maybe it is simply what the transformation produced. I find I care less about the why than about the what, and the what is 30 years of being completely alive. That is not nothing. They smiled when they said the last line. I could tell even through the padded room's glass. We sat in silence for a moment after, which in Rowan is a form of conversation. I did not fill it. Chapter 9. The mixed. The mixed are the city. This is not a demographic observation, though it is that 230,000 people in a city of 245,000 is a majority by any measure. It is a cultural observation. The institutions, the politics, the commerce, the daily texture of life in Rowan, all of it is primarily mixed in its character, built by mixed hands, maintained by mixed decisions. The flower-born are the city's founding myth. The mixed are its operating reality. What it is to be mixed. Mixed individuals in Rowan grow up with a set of advantages so thoroughly normalized that most of them do not experience them as advantages. They have psychic capacity as a baseline. They communicate through a system designed for them. They move through a city built to accommodate their sensory experience. The institutions they interact with were made by people like them, for people like them, and reflect their assumptions at every level. They are also, culturally, always measured against the flower-born, the founders, the people who fought and died in numbers that the mixed can recite from civic education, but cannot personally remember. There is a particular texture to being the dominant group in a society that has built its identity around the sacrifice of a different group. A form of inherited debt that expresses itself, in different individuals, as reverence, as guilt, as fierce protective loyalty, or as the particular defensiveness of people who feel their inheritance is being questioned. The mixed lifespan is somewhat shorter than that of baseline humans, typically between 60 and 70 years, rather than the human average of 70 to 80. This is rarely discussed in the city because it is rarely experienced as significant. 60 years of full psychic capacity in a city designed for psychic capacity is a comfortable life by most measures. Outside observers sometimes note the pattern. Inside the city, it is simply how things are. The internal economy. The internal economy of Rowan is one of the more genuinely remarkable aspects of a city that has several genuinely remarkable aspects, and it receives far less attention than it deserves in most accounts of the place. Between psychic citizens, currency does not change hands. This is not a formal policy. There is no law against it. It is simply a practice that emerged organically from a population that can read each other's needs and intentions with sufficient precision that the mediating function of money becomes largely unnecessary. This works to an extent that would be difficult to believe without witnessing it, because the psychic link makes cheating the system essentially impossible. You cannot claim to have given more than you have. You cannot pretend to need something you do not need. The mutual obligation economy functions on the same principle as the city's governance, radical transparency producing radical honesty at the cost of radical exposure. Common folk deal in gold. Shops that serve travelers accept whatever the customer offers and read from their thoughts whether the offer is honest. The compatibility question. In the course of my research, I became curious about a pattern in the mixed population's genealogy that I had not expected to find, or rather about the absence of a pattern I had expected to be present. The mixed can, in principle, produce offspring with a wide range of peoples, elves, dwarves, halflings, and others. I confirmed this through multiple sources, including the conservatory's own research records. The capacity for interracial union among the mixed is not in question. What is in question is why, in a city of 230,000 people, that capacity appears to produce no actual offspring. I asked about this directly in several interviews. The responses were consistent in their honesty and inconsistent in their explanations. No one I spoke with expressed opposition to the idea. No one described any social stigma attached to it. No one pointed to any policy prohibiting it. The universal response was, in essence, a thoughtful shrug. The most plausible explanation I have found, pieced together from conservatory research notes and the observations of several mixed individuals who had thought more carefully about the question than most, is this. The psychic genetics inherited from flower-born ancestry are in union with human genetics, self-reinforcing. They produce more psychics. In union with the genetics of other races, elves, dwarves, halflings, they are apparently not self-reinforcing. They are suppressed. The offspring of such unions would have dramatically reduced psychic capacity. In Rowan, dramatically reduced psychic capacity means failing the test at age 5, which means the silent plains, which means those children do not survive to adulthood and are not counted in any census and leave no record of their existence. The city does not have a policy against mixed individuals partnering with elves or dwarves. It has a policy that eliminates the children such partnerships would produce. The effect is identical to a prohibition. The mechanism is invisible. I found this, when I understood it, one of the more quietly disturbing things I uncovered during my research, and the competition for that designation was not insignificant. Interview, Taylorn. Taylorn Mixed, senior researcher, Quandia Conservatory, spoke on record. I am happy to discuss my work. I am somewhat less happy to discuss my notes, but I suspect you are going to ask about them anyway, so I will simply say that our filing system is being reviewed and leave it at that. They said this with complete composure and did not elaborate. I matched their composure and also did not elaborate. We proceeded. The psychic genetics research is the most significant work the conservatory has produced in the last 30 years. We understand now, with a precision that Quandia's original researchers could not have imagined, exactly how psychic capacity is inherited, expressed, suppressed, and developed. We understand why some mixed individuals are more capable than others, why some flower-born produce children with dramatically different capacity ranges, and why the overall trajectory of the city's psychic population has been consistently upward across generations. What we understand less well is the origin of the capacity itself. The plants had it before Karan Vane ever touched them. Where did they develop it? How long had they had it? These are the questions I find most interesting, and they are the questions our current research is least equipped to answer, because they require historical and biological evidence from before the underground period, and almost none of that evidence survived. You are going to ask me about the lifespan. I will tell you that I have thoughts about it that I keep largely to myself, because thoughts without sufficient evidence are rumors, and rumors in a city like this travel faster than I would prefer. I will say that the lifespan has characteristics that I find interesting from a purely academic standpoint, and that I intend to pursue those interests through proper research channels rather than published speculation. The last statement was delivered with the particular psychic impression of someone who is telling you precisely as much as they have decided to tell you, and not one word more. I have read the notes they were so carefully not discussing. The thoughts they are keeping to themselves are considerably more developed than this interview suggests. I do not blame them for the discretion. The truth they are sitting on would cause significant pain to a population that has not asked for it and cannot act on it. I am still not certain they are right to stay silent. I am also not certain I would do differently. Sound Warden Mixed, senior rank, spoke off record name and identifying details withheld at their request. I joined because I believed in what the wardens were for. I still believe in what the wardens are for. The original purpose, keeping the city's noise levels safe, warning people before the situation escalates, maintaining the peace that makes this city what it is. I believe in all of that. I am still doing all of that. What I will say is that the definition of escalation has changed since I joined. What constitutes a warning level event and what constitutes a punishment level event? Those lines have moved. I am not comfortable describing exactly how they have moved or in which direction because I still have a job that I need to keep doing. But I will say that the people who draw those lines are not always drawing them in the same place I would draw them, and there are days when that is difficult to be at peace with. The travelers, the common folk visitors, some of them are genuinely disruptive and genuinely harmful, and the response they receive is proportionate. Some of them are simply people who do not know the rules yet and are learning. I try to distinguish between those two categories. I am not certain that everyone I work with tries as hard as I do. They declined to continue after this point. I thanked them. They nodded and left without a word, which in Rowan is simply how people leave rooms. Chapter 10. The Common Folk. There are approximately 2,000 common folk living in Rowan at the time of this writing. 2,000 people, in a city of 245,000, who wake up every morning and perform an act of sustained, careful, exhausting theater. The blue hair dye is available in 3 shades at a small shop in the southern quarter whose proprietor does not ask questions. The gold eye coverings come from the same shop. The apparatus is issued by the city. The rest, the silence, the careful management of expression and movement and breath, the constant awareness of who is near and whether they are paying attention, that is assembled by each person individually, from scratch, every day. I want to be precise about what I am describing. This is not the ordinary social performance that everyone, in every city, conducts to some degree. This is something more total. The common folk of Rowan cannot slip. There is no private space in a city of psychics where slipping is safe. The performance is continuous, and the audience never fully leaves. Content note: the following section contains accounts of psychic assault and descriptions of the ambient punishment system as experienced by its targets. These accounts are included because they are true, and because the people who experienced them agreed to have their experiences recorded. The punishment they cannot name. The mind sliver system, the practice by which residents of the city, individually and without coordination, cast weakened versions of the spell on people who are being disruptive, is not a secret in any formal sense. The city's leadership is aware of it. The sound wardens are aware of it. Every psychic resident is aware of it because many of them participate in it, in the reflexive, barely considered way that people perform small acts of social enforcement in any community. The common folk targets of this system are, by and large, not aware of it. They are aware of the headaches. They are aware of the creeping cognitive fog that follows periods of speaking at normal volume in public. They are aware that the beast warning has a particular quality of personal relevance that they did not expect a folk tale to have. Most of them have attributed these experiences to stress, to the accumulated discomfort of living in an environment that was not built for them. Some have attributed it to the beasts. None of the common folk I interviewed knew what was actually happening to them until I told them. The reactions to this information were varied. The merchant laughed, briefly and without humor, and said it explained a great deal. The cleric already knew, through divine channels that apparently include the capacity to detect psychic interference, and had chosen not to mention it to anyone because they did not consider it their city's politics to comment on. The one who had come from the draconic continent and found belonging here looked genuinely distressed for a moment, and then settled into something I can only describe as a complicated piece. Interview: the merchant. Anonymous common folk, merchant 2 years in Rowan, spoke on record. Name withheld by request. The money is good. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect me to have a more complicated reason, and honestly, the money is most of it. The psychic items market here, if you know what you are doing and you have relationships with the conservatory staff, and I have spent 2 years building those relationships, is unlike anything in the region. I move pieces that I could not source anywhere else at prices that make sense for both sides. When I have enough, I am leaving. That is the plan. That has always been the plan. Is it comfortable? No. I wear the hair. I wear the eyes. I keep my mouth shut in public, which is not something that comes naturally to me and has required more adjustment than I expected. The headaches I thought were the city air. Now you tell me. That is yes. That explains things. I do not hate it here. I want to be clear about that too because I think people expect a simpler story. The city is beautiful and it is safe in a way that no city I have lived in has been safe, and the people are not unkind to me when I behave. They are not unkind. They are simply not particularly interested. I am a feature of the commercial landscape. That is fine. I did not come here to be interesting to anyone. They left as soon as the interview concluded, politely and efficiently, in the manner of someone with a schedule they are keeping to. I liked them considerably. Interview: Luca Viri. Luca Viri, common folk, psychic origin undisclosed. Long-term resident, spoke on record. I will not tell you where I am from. You can speculate. I know you will anyway. They said this looking directly at me with the particular expression of someone who has assessed what I am likely to know and has decided not to confirm it. Based on the cadence of their speech patterns and certain turns of phrase, I am reasonably confident they originate somewhere on the draconic continents. I did not push. There are places I intend to go later and stories I would prefer to gather fresh. I traveled for years before I found this place. I knew what I was looking for, a city where psychic ability was not something to apologize for, where it was not something people flinched from or accused you of misusing or used as a reason to, where it was simply how you were, and that was acceptable. I found that here. I found more than that here. I found a city that has built its entire existence around what I am. I understand that you are writing about the harder parts. The children, the common folk. I know what you are going to say about those things, and I know some of it will make this place look worse than it feels to live in. I will tell you something honestly. I am more extreme in my opinions than most flower-born I have spoken with. I believe that psychic ability produces better outcomes, more honest communication, less violence, less of the willful blindness that I watched cause enormous harm in the place I came from. I believe this city is genuinely trying to build something better. I believe the methods are sometimes wrong. I hold both of those things. What happened to me before I came here, I will not go into detail. I will say that in the place I grew up, what I am was a reason to hurt me. People did. Repeatedly, and with community approval, and with language that I will not reproduce because it is not language I choose to carry. I came here and a flower-born read my thoughts at the gate and said, through my apparatus, that I was welcome, and that was the first time in my life that my mind felt like something other than a problem. They stopped there. I did not ask them to continue. There are interviews that reach the edge of what a person can give, and it is the interviewer's responsibility to recognize the edge and stop before it. I thanked them. They nodded and looked out the padded room's small window at the street beyond, where the city was doing what it always does, moving in silence precisely, like something that has learned to exist without making a sound. Interview: Bryn Asheville. Bryn Asheville common folk, cleric of Ogma Dwarven, long-term occasional resident, spoke on record. I am not here the way the others you are speaking with are here. I have a room at the Covered Lantern when I am in the city, which is perhaps a third of the year. The rest of the time I am in Arborea, or on the road between, or at one of the 3 facilities I help maintain on the material plane side of the portal. I am, in the most literal sense, a traveler passing through. I have been passing through this particular city for 22 years. What do I think of it? I think it is exactly what Ogma would wish for a people. Total honesty. The impossibility of sustained deception. A community built on the actual transmission of thought rather than the performance of it. If you believe, as I do, that knowledge and truth are the highest goods a civilization can orient itself toward, then Rowan is a city pursuing those goods with a directness that most civilizations never manage. There is a reason the Temple of the Open Mind is what it is. These people understand something about the value of an open mind that most of the world does not. The politics, I am a cleric, not a diplomat. I observe and I worship and I facilitate what I can facilitate between Arborea and this plane, and I keep my opinions about civic policy to myself because they are not mine to have. I will say that Ogma does not, in my experience, distinguish between minds worth opening and minds not worth the effort. I will leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. The portal is real. The light in that room is real. I have walked through it more times than I can count, and I find it, still, every time, affecting in a way that I cannot adequately describe to someone who has not done it. For now, I simply go back and forth and carry what I can between the two. She poured a second cup of tea during this last answer, pushed one across to me without being asked, and continued without interruption. She was, of all the people I spoke with in Rowan, the most comfortable in her own existence. I found this restful after the heavier interviews that preceded her. Why they stay, why they go. The accounts I gathered from common folk who have left Rowan, collected during my 2 weeks in the surrounding city-states, form a different kind of document than the interviews above. They are retrospective, colored by distance, shaped by whatever the act of leaving did to how these people understand the place they left. What I found, consistently, was that the people who left Rowan did not leave hatting it. Most of them left exhausted. There is a particular quality of exhaustion that comes from sustained performance in an environment that reads your every slip, and the people who described it to me used remarkably similar language across interviews conducted in different cities with people who had no contact with each other. The word that came up most often, in various forms, was wait. The people who stay, the merchant, Luca Viri, Bryn Asheville, the dozens of others I spoke with briefly or observed from a distance, have each found a reason sufficient to carry the weight. Money, belonging, faith, the specific peace that comes from a city that is genuinely safe for someone who has not been safe elsewhere. These are real reasons. They are not small ones. Every city is a test, and simply doesn't pretend otherwise. End of Part 2. Part 3. The architecture of power. Power in most cities is visible. It wears armor, sits on thrones, announces itself with ceremony and architecture designed to communicate who is in charge and what happens if you forget it. Rowan's power is different. It wears normal clothing. It walks the same streets as everyone else. It knows what you are thinking before you decide whether to act on it. The architecture of power in Rowan is not physical. It is psychic, institutional, and 2 centuries deep. Understanding it requires understanding, not just what the city's institutions are, but what they were built to do, what they actually do, and the distance between those 2 things. Chapter 11. The Deliberation Circle. I attended 2 sessions of the Deliberation Circle during my stay, once early in my visit when I was still learning the city's rhythms, and once near the end when I had enough context to understand what I was watching. The second visit was considerably more instructive than the first. The chamber is in the administrative quarter, a building that announces itself with the same clean geometric restraint as the rest of Rowan's architecture, pale stone, high ceilings, nothing that could be described as ostentatious. The room itself is circular and organized into distinct levels. The council floor at the bottom holds 24 seats arranged in an inward-facing ring, 20 for elected representatives of the general population, and 4 permanently designated for flower-born members, positioned equidistant around the circle. At the center of the ring is a slightly raised platform where any citizen may stand to have their thoughts read by the council directly. What the transparency feels like. Sitting in the observer tiers of the deliberation circle is an experience I find difficult to describe without reaching for language that sounds more dramatic than the reality. It is not dramatic. It is quiet and orderly and conducted with the particular efficiency of people who have been doing this for generations. The citizen who came to the center platform during the second session I attended was a mixed woman of perhaps 40 years who had a concern about the allocation of maintenance resources in her district. She stood at the center, and the council read her directly. Not just her words. Her. The frustration behind the concern, the specific instances she was drawing on, the fear underneath the frustration that what she was describing would not be addressed. When she stepped down, 3 council members responded in sequence with responses precisely targeted to what she had actually communicated, rather than what she had technically said. It is, I will say plainly, the most honest deliberative process I have ever observed. I have attended legislative sessions in 14 different cities and witnessed the full range of what passes for governance in the Flaking Realms. None of them came close to this in terms of the quality of actual communication happening. What the transparency does not do. The circle does not fix its voting mechanism. I described in part 1 the structural problem. Votes are delivered through psychic transmission to a designated receiver, which means that council members who cannot transmit psychically, who were present in the early decades of the circle's operation, and who are effectively absent now, could stand at the center and be read and not cast a vote that was received. The problem has not been corrected because the people who would need to correct it are the people for whom it is not a problem. What I observed in the 2 sessions I attended was a council of 24 members who were all psychic, all mixed or flower-born, all products of a city that has spent a century ensuring its governing institutions reflect its psychic majority. The circle is transparent in the ways that benefit the people inside it. It is opaque in the ways that would benefit the people it has systematically excluded from it. I asked my administrative guide, at the end of my second session, whether there had ever been a serious proposal to reform the voting mechanism to allow non-psychic participation. They considered this for a moment, genuinely considered it, I could tell, and then said that the question assumed non-psychic council members were a realistic possibility, which required first addressing the question of how non-psychic individuals would be elected to a council whose electorate communicated primarily through psychic channels. I noted the answer in my records. It is the most elegant description of a closed loop I have encountered in 40 years of asking inconvenient questions. Chapter 12. The Blooming Party. The Blooming Party has governed Rowan for over a century. In that time, it has overseen a period of genuine prosperity, significant expansion of the city's regional influence, the development of the conservatory into a world-class research institution, the growth of the Temple of the Open Mind into the multi-sectioned complex it is today, and the consolidation of the creature training economy into the dominant regional industry it has become. It has also overseen the Secure Future Act, the Child Testing Protocol, the effective elimination of common folk political representation, and the ambient enforcement system described in Part 2. I want to be precise about the order in which I listed those things, because the order matters. The Blooming Party is not a party that exists to do harm. It is a party that exists to protect something it values, and that has, in the course of that protection, caused harm that it experiences as regrettable necessity rather than as harm. That distinction is not exculpatory. It is explanatory, and understanding it is necessary for understanding why the party has the support it has, and why that support is unlikely to change. Interview, Fing Kors. Fing Kors, mixed, senior council member, Blooming Party, spoke on record. I will answer your questions directly. I have read enough of your previous volumes to know that evasion does not serve anyone's interests and that you will find out whatever I do not tell you by other means. I would rather you have the accurate version. The child testing protocol. You want to start there. Very well. The protocol is not compulsory. This is the fact that most outside accounts omit, either because they do not know it or because it complicates the narrative they have already decided to write. Parents may opt their children out. The child will not be tested, will not be sent to the plains, and will not be eligible for citizenship in Rowan. They may remain as a resident under the same terms as any non-citizen visitor. This option exists. It is chosen by a small minority of families. Why do most families volunteer their children? Because Rowan has genuine benefits that people are willing to sacrifice for. Full citizenship here means full participation in the psychic community, full access to the city's internal economy, full protection of the guard structure, full access to the temple's services, full belonging in a place that functions at a level most cities in the Flaking Realms cannot approach. People understand what they are exchanging for that. They make the exchange. It is not my place to tell them they are wrong to do so. I am aware that children with latent psychic ability that has not yet developed may fail the testing. I am aware that this happens. The conservatory has documented cases, and we have discussed them at the council level. It is an imperfect system. I do not have a perfect system to offer in its place that would still accomplish what the testing accomplishes. If you find one, I will support it. I asked whether the city had considered extending the testing age to allow for later developing psychic ability to manifest. They were quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, and said that the question had been raised and that the current age had been set based on conservatory research into typical development windows. They did not say the research was conclusive. I noted that. The city works. I know that sounds insufficient given the weight of your questions, but I want you to sit with what that means. We do not have crime. We do not have poverty. We do not have the kind of violence that characterizes most cities of comparable size. We have built something that functions through a shared commitment to principles that require difficult decisions to establish and require continued will to maintain. I am not asking you to celebrate those decisions. I am asking you to weigh them against what they produced. They said this last part with complete sincerity and no detectable dishonesty. I found their arguments more difficult to dismiss than I had anticipated, which is either a sign that they have merit or a sign that I spent too long in a city that is very good at making its arrangements feel reasonable. I spent 2 days after this interview thinking about the difference between those two possibilities. I include the interview in full because I think the reader deserves the opportunity to be as uncertain as I was. What the Blooming Party does well. The conservatory under Blooming Party stewardship has become the preeminent institution of psychic research in the known world. The regional stability the party has maintained through the Creature Management Program represents an ongoing service to every city-state in the area that cannot be easily quantified, but is genuinely felt. The city's internal social cohesion, the genuine warmth of the psychic community toward its own members, the mutual obligation economy, the collective grief practices, the functional absence of interpersonal crime. These are products of the culture the Blooming Party has cultivated and protected. They are worth having. They are not worth having at any cost, but they are worth having. What the Blooming Party does not acknowledge. The opt-in framing of the child testing protocol depends on parents making an informed choice. The Together Party's position, which I will cover in the next chapter, is that the choice is not informed. That most families do not understand what the planes actually do to the children sent there. That the children who return carry damage that the city's healers acknowledge and decline to address. That the opt-out option is, in practice, not a real option for families who have no viable life outside Rowan. I asked Fincors about the mental blocks. They acknowledged their existence. They described them as a known outcome of a traumatic experience and noted that the Temple of the Open Mind offers support services to returned children. I asked whether those services were effective. They said they were available. I did not find that answer satisfying. I do not believe they found it satisfying either. Chapter 13. The Opposition. In a city where the governing party has held power for over a century, the opposition tells you something important. Not about what power could be, but about what power permits. The Together Party and the Communication Party exist because the Blooming Party allows them to exist, and they exist in the forms they take because those forms do not threaten anything the Blooming Party considers essential. The Communication Party. Karen Solai, mixed senior member, Communication Party trade specialist, spoke on record. People always want to talk about the social politics. I understand why. The social politics are visible and dramatic, and they involve things people have strong feelings about. My work involves horses. Considerably less drama in horses, I find. The Communication Party is the second largest party in the council and has been for most of the city's political history. We are simply quiet about it because our work is quiet. Trade relationships, research partnerships, diplomatic channels with the city-states that need our creature training services and our items and our healers. The infrastructure of how this city actually sustains itself economically. Nobody writes about that. You are the first journalist who has asked me a substantive question about revenue streams in 20 years of doing this work. The creature training operation is the largest single revenue source the city has. 38% of our total economic intake, which in absolute terms represents a figure that would surprise most people who think of Rowan primarily as a city of psychic healers and exotic magic items. We train everything: horses, war horses, royal mounts, birds, dogs, hunting animals, working animals, beasts of burden, military creatures of various classifications. Every major kingdom in the Flaking Realms has Rowan-trained animals in its cavalry and its royal stables. Most of them do not know that is what they have, because the training is sold through intermediaries who prefer not to advertise the origin. Some kingdoms have complicated feelings about doing business with us. They have less complicated feelings about having the best trained animals in the region. The psychic communication with animals, the direct link, the genuine understanding of what a creature needs and fears and is capable of produces a quality of training that conventional methods simply cannot replicate. We do not break animals. We do not train through fear. We understand them and they understand us, and the result is an animal that performs not because it has been conditioned to, but because it has been genuinely taught. I attempted to redirect toward the child testing protocol at this point. Karen Solai listened to the question with the patient expression of someone who has heard it before and made peace with not having an opinion about it. That is genuinely outside my area. I have thoughts about most things, but I try to only offer thoughts I have actually examined carefully, and I have not examined that question carefully because it is not what I do. What I do is make sure this city can feed itself and fund itself and maintain the relationships it needs to keep doing what it does. She said this without evasion or discomfort. It was simply the truth of how she had organized her professional life. I respect the clarity of it even as I note that the Communication Party's consistent focus on economic questions at the expense of social ones is itself a political choice, and that the prosperity her work helps maintain is part of what makes the Blooming Party's arrangements sustainable. She would likely agree with this assessment and find it beside the point. We would both be right. The Together Party. The Together Party is the most controversial political entity in Rowan, which is a remarkable achievement for a party that has never held a council majority and whose practical influence on city policy over the past century can be measured in small increments and frequent reversals. Their platform advocates for the elimination of the child testing protocol, the restoration of meaningful common folk representation in the deliberation circle, reform of the Sound Warden's mandate to include explicit accountability mechanisms, and a review of the opt-in framing of the testing protocol to ensure informed consent. These are not, as stated, extreme positions. They are the positions of people who have looked at the city's arrangements and concluded that several of them cause harm that the city has not fully reckoned with. The problem in a psychic city is that the Together Party tends to feel extreme even when its stated positions are not. The emotion behind the positions, the anger, the grief, the specific kind of frustration that comes from watching harm occur and being unable to stop it, is felt by every psychic in the room before anyone has stood at the center. The Together Party member approaching the center platform arrives already read, already understood, already categorized by an audience that has felt the temperature of their conviction and made a preliminary judgment about whether that temperature is trustworthy. It is not a fair process. It is the process they have. Anonymous mixed-together party members spoke on record, name withheld. I want to tell you about a child I know, 8 years old now, sent to the plains at 5 with the full consent of their parents, who understood what they were agreeing to in the way that most parents understand it, which is to say they knew the words and not the reality. The child came back. They had psychic ability. They had always had psychic ability. The conservatory confirmed it afterward. It simply had not expressed by the testing age. They came back and they were different. Different is not a strong enough word. The child who came back was not the child who left. They do not speak about what happened in the plains. They cannot speak about it, not because they choose not to, but because something has been placed over that memory so completely that attempting to access it produces a physical reaction, shaking, nausea, an instinctive recoil that the healers at the temple describe as a deeply embedded protective response. They have tried to address it. Most have stopped trying. One told me privately that removing the block would require engaging with whatever created it, and that whatever created it is something they are not equipped to engage with and would prefer not to antagonize. I asked what they meant by that. They declined to elaborate. I have my own thoughts about what they meant, which I will address in Part 5. The Blooming Party says parents make an informed choice. This child's parents made an informed choice. They chose citizenship. They chose the city and everything the city offers, and I do not blame them. I understand exactly why they chose it. What they did not choose, what nobody told them they were choosing, is what the plains actually do, not the creatures. Though the creatures are real and terrible. The other thing. The thing their child came back with lodged in their mind like a splinter that the best healers in the city cannot remove without risking something they are afraid to name. I am called extreme. I know how I read to people in the circle when I am angry. I know my anger is felt before I ever approach the center, and I know that is used to dismiss what I am communicating before I communicate it. I am asking you to print what I am saying anyway. That is the only tool I have that works outside the circle. They were composed throughout this interview in the careful way of someone who has learned to manage their emotional temperature in public, because they know what happens when they do not. The composure did not hide the grief. It was simply layered over it neatly, like a cloth over something that is still moving underneath. I thanked them. They asked me to be accurate. I told them I would try. It is the most I can honestly promise anyone. Note on the mental blocks following this interview, I accessed conservatory research records on the psychological outcomes of children returned from the plains. The documentation is thorough, and the conclusions are clearly stated. The mental blocks present in returned children are consistent across cases in ways that trauma alone does not produce. Trauma is variable. These blocks are not. They follow a pattern, the same pattern in child after child, that the researchers describe in careful language as suggesting external intervention of a consistent and deliberate nature. I approached Bryn Asheville with this finding. She listened, asked one question about the nature of the pattern, and declined to comment further. She did not look surprised. I noted that too. Chapter 14. The Sound Wardens. Marin Var built the Sound Wardens to be a community resource. He imagined something like a neighborhood watch with psychic capacity, people who cared about the city's well-being and were equipped to help maintain it, working alongside their neighbors rather than above them. He imagined, I think, something that would become less necessary over time as the education centers did their work and the city's common folk population integrated more thoroughly into its norms. What the Sound Wardens became is something else entirely, and the distance between Var's intention and the current institution is a useful measure of how far the city has traveled from the values of its founding era. What they are. The Sound Wardens are the city's primary enforcement mechanism for noise-related violations and general public order. They number in the hundreds, distributed throughout the city's districts, and they operate in plain clothing. In most cities, enforcement is visible: the armor, the insignia, the deliberate signals that say this is authority and it is watching you. The Sound Wardens wear what their neighbors wear. They walk the same streets, browse the same markets. A psychic resident knows who they are by the particular quality of their mental presence, the trained attentiveness that comes through in their psychic signature the way a specific kind of posture comes through in a person's physical bearing. A common folk resident does not know, cannot know. For the city's psychic majority, this is unremarkable. For the 2,000 common folk residents who navigate daily life without the ability to identify who among their neighbors is and is not enforcement, it is a form of surveillance that has no equivalent I have encountered in any other city I have visited. The effect on behavior is predictable and, one assumes, intentional. When you cannot identify who might be watching, you behave as though everyone is. What they do. The official mandate of the sound wardens covers 3 areas: monitoring for noise violations, issuing warnings to first-time or minor offenders, and escalating to physical intervention or re-education protocols for sustained or serious violations. In practice, the execution of this mandate involves a psychic probe system that begins at the level of a mild pressure and escalates through increasing intensity to a level sufficient to render a subject unconscious if deemed necessary. What the official mandate does not cover, and what the wardens do not officially acknowledge, is the ambient enforcement system described in Part 2, the individually initiated mind sliver responses that occur without coordination, without order, and without accountability. The wardens know it happens. The city leadership knows it happens. The framework that would define it as a violation and create consequences for it does not exist. Because creating that framework would require the city to acknowledge that what its residents do to loud visitors and common folk is a form of assault rather than a natural community response to disruption. What Marin Var built, a community resource, lightly staffed, focused on education and gentle warning, intended to become less necessary over time. What the sound wardens are now, an unmarked enforcement presence throughout the city, psychically surveilling a population that largely cannot identify them, operating alongside an informal punishment network that they oversee without accountability. The distance between these two things is not the result of malice. It is the result of 100 small decisions made by people who found each expansion of the mandate reasonable at the time. This is, I have found, how most institutions travel from what they were meant to be to what they are. One reasonable decision at a time. Chapter 15. The guard structure. Rowan has 4 tiers of guard, each with a distinct mandate, a distinct operational area, and a distinct relationship to the city's power structure. Understanding them as a system rather than as separate institutions is important, because the system is what produces the particular quality of safety and surveillance that defines daily life in the city. The lower city guard. The most visible tier and the one that most travelers will have direct contact with. The lower city guard patrol the general streets, manage the intake process for arriving visitors, and handle the ordinary civic functions that any city's ground-level enforcement addresses. They are psychically capable, but are not specialists. They are the face the city chooses to show, and that face is efficient and not unkind. The upper city guard. The 7 towers of the upper city guard are landmarks as much as they are operational posts. Visible from nearly every point in the city, their dark blue observation windows catching and holding light in ways that are probably not accidental. The upper guard are specialists in citywide psychic surveillance and communication, maintaining coverage of the streets below through a combination of visual observation and psychic reach that gives them effective awareness of any significant event in their quadrant almost immediately after it occurs. The communication between towers happens through psychic links that operate faster than any messenger system and with more precision than any signal code. An event in the eastern quarter is known in the western tower within moments. A visitor causing a disturbance receives a message through their apparatus from a source they cannot locate, delivered with the calm specificity of someone who has been watching for longer than the visitor realized. The towers are the nervous system of the city's enforcement infrastructure. The High City Guard. The High City Guard are specialists deployed to protect the city's significant institutions: the conservatory, the temple of the open mind, the deliberation circle chamber, and similar locations that represent significant concentrations of value or vulnerability. They are stronger than the lower guard, more specifically trained, and recognizable primarily by the addition of a visible weapon to what is otherwise the same unremarkable civilian clothing that the city's enforcement favors. Their deployment at institutional rather than residential locations reflects the city's priorities clearly. The conservatory and the temple are more important to protect than any individual district. The Royal Guard. The Royal Guard are something different in kind rather than just in degree. They protect the council head and senior council members, coordinate the response to large-scale noise-eater threats, and are occasionally dispatched to neighboring city-states to address creature incursions that those states cannot handle independently. They are significantly more capable than the other guard tiers, operating at a level of power that places them among the more formidable individuals in the region. And they are trained in both physical combat and psychic defense, including the specific and rare capacity to identify, resist, and sever psychic links being used against them or others. They wear armor, which in Rowan is itself notable. Not the heavy plate of military forces on the draconic continents, lighter, more functional, designed to minimize noise while providing genuine protection, but recognizable as armor nonetheless, the only uniformed presence in a city that otherwise deliberately obscures the boundary between enforcement and civilian life. The problem of export. When the Royal Guard are dispatched to neighboring city-states, which happens several times a year, typically in response to large noise-eater threats, they bring with them something the host cities do not always anticipate, the particular psychic sensitivity of people who have spent their careers in a city of complete silence. Rowan is quiet. The world outside Rowan is not. Royal Guard members deployed to assist neighboring settlements are exposed, suddenly and without significant preparation, to the ambient noise of cities that have not organized themselves around the management of sound. The documentation on this describes a consistent pattern of heightened psychic reactivity in deployed Guard members, which in the less careful language of the Together Party representative I spoke with afterward, translates to people who are in genuine discomfort and are known, on occasion, to express that discomfort in ways their hosts find alarming. The reputation of Rowan's guardsmen for short tempers in the field is well established in the regional diplomatic records I reviewed. Neighboring city-states are grateful for the assistance, efficient in their thanks, and notably quick to see the Guard members back on their way home. The noise-eater problem gets solved. The solving of it leaves a particular impression. Both things are true simultaneously, and both things serve the city's interests. Power that does not announce itself is not less powerful for the silence. It is more. End of Part 3. Part 4. The places. Every city is, at some level, a physical argument. The buildings, the streets, the way water moves and light falls, and people are guided from one place to another. These are not neutral choices. They are decisions about what matters, what should be easy to find and what should require effort, who belongs in which spaces and under what conditions. Rowan makes this argument with more deliberateness than most cities, and understanding the argument requires walking the streets and sitting in the rooms and standing at the fences that mark what is and is not for you. Chapter 16. Arriving and moving through the city. I will describe my first arrival because it was the arrival of someone who did not know what they were walking into, which is the arrival most of my readers will have. The second arrival, 2 months later, prepared, equipped, and considerably less surprised, produced different observations, and I will note those where they are useful. But the first arrival is the one that tells you what Rowan actually does to a person who encounters it without preparation. The road changes before the gate. The stones give way to something with more yield, and then you look down and realize the road itself has changed. The white tiles begin outside the city proper, as though the city is already beginning to manage you before it has formally received you. The gate attendants are calm and efficient and entirely silent. One of them looked at me for approximately 3 seconds, and I felt the distinct and not entirely comfortable sensation of being briefly, thoroughly read. Then they waved our party through to intake, and the sensation passed. The intake. The intake process has been described earlier in this volume, and I will not repeat it in full. What I will add is the texture of it as an experience. The quiet room, the written materials, the representative who delivered the city's rules through psychic transmission to the one member of our party who could receive it, who then translated for the rest of us in the slightly flattened way that translated psychic communication always sounds, as though something essential has been lost between the original and the version you are hearing. The apparatus is a small crystalline device that sits behind the ear and warms slightly when active. On my first visit, I found it disorienting. On my second visit, having spent 2 months using it, I found it efficient and occasionally graceful. The city's residents learn early to compress meaning, and what comes through the apparatus often carries more information than the words technically contain. My companion on the first visit, a barbarian of considerable physical capability and equally considerable vocal volume, whose name I have consistently declined to record in these pages, and whose relationship with the concept of whispering I can best describe as theoretical, received 3 apparatus transmissions within the first hour of our arrival, each one a politely worded reminder about noise levels. By the 4th day, he was experiencing what he described as a persistent headache that moved when he spoke. We departed on the 5th morning. He has since recovered entirely and continues to be very loud in many other cities. I wish him well. The waterways. The most elegant piece of infrastructure in Rowan is one that most visitors do not immediately recognize as infrastructure. The fountains are the first thing you notice, large, still basins of water in front of every significant landmark, their surfaces undisturbed, producing no sound beyond the absolute minimum that water produces when it is simply present and not moving. From these fountains flow the waterways, narrow channels cut into the street's surface, carrying water in slow, deliberate streams that branch and connect across the entire city in a network that looks, from above, like a vast and intricate root system. The waterways are the city's navigation system. There are no signs in Rowan. If you want to know how to get somewhere, you ask, through your apparatus, through a gesture to a passing resident, and you are told to follow a specific waterway. This is not merely a practical choice. It is an expression of the city's fundamental social architecture. You cannot be self-sufficient in Rowan. You cannot navigate it alone without assistance. Every time you need to find something, you must establish contact with the city and its people. And every time you establish that contact, you are briefly, gently reminded that you are a guest in a space that operates on terms you do not fully share. The towers and the streets. There are no alleys in Rowan. I noticed this on my first visit without quite registering its significance, cataloging it as an aesthetic preference. On my second visit, understanding more about how the city works, I understood it differently. From any point on any street in Rowan, at least one of the 7 towers is visible. Usually 2. The geometry of the streets has been designed so that the upper city guard's line of sight covers the entire city without gap. There is nowhere to go that is not observable. The absence of alleys is not an aesthetic preference. It is the physical expression of the same principle that governs the psychic network and the sound wardens, and the deliberation circles transparency. In Rowan, there are no hidden spaces, no corners where things happen unobserved. On being invisible here, I will describe something that happened during my second visit that I found instructive enough to include here, despite its somewhat personal nature. I travel with certain protections as a matter of professional habit, including the capacity to become invisible when the situation warrants it. In most cities, this works as expected. In Rowan, it worked considerably less well than expected. Within approximately 10 minutes of moving through the city in an invisible state, I noticed that residents were tracking my movement. Not visually, but in the particular way that people orient themselves toward something they are aware of without being able to see it. The city does not see you. It feels you. Invisibility, in a community of psychics, addresses exactly the wrong sense. Out of professional curiosity, I subsequently used a mind blank effect and moved through the city again. The response was immediate and considerably more dramatic. Several residents looked at the space I occupied with expressions of confusion that shaded, in some cases, toward discomfort, the particular discomfort of someone reaching for something familiar and finding a gap where it should be. 2 children looked actively distressed. A young flower-born girl of perhaps 7 years sat down abruptly on the street tiles and began crying in the silent way that flower-born children cry. No sound, just the physical reality of tears. And an adult rushed to her side and held her and looked around with the focused attention of someone trying to locate the source of the problem. I ended the effect immediately. I was guided within 2 minutes. To a private room by individuals I am fairly confident were sound wardens, where communication was conducted with difficulty through my apparatus and several written notes, and where the general consensus was that whatever I had done I should not do it again in a public area. I agreed. I meant it. The girl's face has stayed with me. The lesson: in a city of psychics, the mind is the primary means by which people recognize each other. Being invisible is a curiosity. Being mentally absent is something closer to a small horror. The social architecture. A final note on moving through the city that visitors should understand before they arrive, and that no official briefing will tell them. You will see residents enter homes that are not their own. You will see people take food from another's kitchen, rest on another's furniture, borrow another's tools, all with the ease of someone using their own possessions. This is not theft. It is the physical expression of the city's internal social network, a web of established permissions and mutual understandings that residents have built with each other over years of psychic familiarity, a running shared sense of who is welcome where and under what conditions. Do not attempt to replicate this. You do not have the network. What reads as easy community in a resident reads as intrusion in a visitor, and the city will know the difference before you have finished the thought. A brief inquiry into the cuisine of Rowan, being the standard culinary assessment conducted in every volume of this series. I maintain, in the face of considerable critical indifference, that a city's food tells you more about it than its politics. Politics can be performed. Hunger cannot. What a city eats is what a city is, and Rowan eats with the particular sweetness of a place that has made peace with its constraints and found within them something genuinely worth savoring. The city's diet runs heavily to the sweet end of the spectrum. Fruit from the orchards maintained at the edges of the silent plains, stone fruits primarily, along with several varieties I could not identify that had the particular intensity of things grown in contested soil. Honey in abundance, sourced from hives kept in the surrounding region and traded in quantities that suggest the city has a significant relationship with its beekeepers. Grain arrives processed and is handled with the quiet efficiency of a city that understands preservation, breads and cakes and dense sweet pastries that keep well and taste of effort. Meat is present and precious. The city cannot keep significant livestock for reasons of noise, and what arrives from neighboring states commands prices that reflect the journey. What I ate of it was well prepared in the way that scarce ingredients tend to be well prepared, by people who understand that waste is a particular offense when the ingredient is difficult to replace. The covered lantern serves a fruit and honey tart that I would describe as exceptional if I did not worry that the description would set expectations I cannot adequately prepare readers for. It is warm. It is the color of late afternoon. Holding it is like holding something that has decided to be entirely itself without apology, and drinking it. It is both food and something that functions like tea. I was not entirely sure how to categorize it. Produces a mood of gentle and unearned contentment that lasts approximately half an hour and fades without sadness. The recipe is not available. I asked. The answer was a polite smile and a second serving, which I accepted and which I consider a fair trade. If you want to know what it tastes like, come to Row and find the covered lantern. There are worse reasons to make the journey. Chapter 17. The Quayandia Conservatory of Mind and Matter. The building announces itself before you reach it. Not through size, it is not the largest structure in the city, but through the quality of attention that surrounds it. You feel, moving toward it along the waterway that leads to its main entrance, a faint increase in the ambient psychic presence of the area, the particular concentration of focused minds that gathers wherever serious intellectual work is happening. The architecture is clean and severe in the particular way of buildings that have been designed by people who consider ornament a distraction from function. Pale stone and deep blue-tinted glass in geometric forms that catch the light differently at each hour. Achieved, I was told by a staff member, through the specific angle of the glass panels and the properties of the stone rather than through any enchantment. The building is beautiful because it was designed carefully. This is rarer than it should be. The outer halls. The outer halls of the conservatory are where the institution meets the public, and they have been designed with the understanding that most of the public they meet will not be psychic. The displays are visual as well as psychic. The staff speak through apparatus with a fluency that suggests regular practice with non-psychic visitors. I spent approximately 4 hours in the outer halls across 2 visits and came away with 5 items and a considerably lighter travel fund. I regret nothing. Communication apparatus. The standard issue device provided to visitors, here sold in a more refined form with greater range and clarity than the intake version. I purchased one as a reference item. It functions as described elsewhere in this volume and will serve any non-psychic traveler well. Mental fortification charm. A small charm worn at the throat that significantly increases the wearer's resistance to psychic influence and mental attack. It operates once per day and must be consciously activated. It is, for its quality, remarkably inexpensive. The limitation of 1 use per day is real and should be planned around accordingly. Telepathic conduit earring. This was the item I wore for most of my stay, and the one I found most practically useful. A small earring that allows the wearer to send and receive on psychic communication wavelengths. The limitation is significant. Attempting to communicate with someone who lacks psychic capacity or their own apparatus produces a stream of information too dense to parse clearly, reducible only to single-word transmission. Speaking to a psychic, however, is genuinely seamless. Clarity circlet. A larger item, worn on the head, that increases cognitive capacity in ways that I can only describe by analogy. It does for the mind what a belt of giant strength does for the body. The increase in processing speed, retention, and analytical capacity during the hours I wore it was significant enough to be slightly alarming and significant enough that I used it for every session of research that required the absorption of large amounts of material quickly. I have since missed it considerably. Threat awareness choker. A piece featuring a small carved flower at the throat that responds to hostile intent within a meaningful radius, alerting the wearer and providing a directional sense of the source. Outside the city, it is among the most useful defensive items I have encountered. I wore it every day after leaving. The information siphons. The most extraordinary items in the conservatory's outer halls are the information siphons, small crystalline vessels that contain, in compressed psychic form, the distilled skills and memories of people who have chosen to donate them. Row. And elderly residents may donate memories and skills to the conservatory's research program. The donation is genuine. The memories are removed, which means the donor no longer has them. The conservatory processes these donations in 2 ways. Some become research material. Others are purified and compressed into the siphons, which can then be used by a willing recipient to acquire the skill or knowledge in question. I purchased one. I selected a comprehensive foundation in culinary arts, belonging to a woman who had spent 40 years feeding the covered lantern's guests, and who had chosen, at the end of her working life, to donate what she knew. I am now, apparently, an accomplished cook. I find this both genuinely useful and faintly absurd. I have made the fruit and honey tart from the covered lantern's menu twice from memory since leaving the city. It is not quite right. I think the proprietors have an ingredient they do not include in the version they serve to guests. I intend to go back and ask them about it. There are rumors, noted in the conservatory's research records with the careful language of people who do not want to be accused of making claims they cannot support, that the siphon process can in theory be applied to inscribed soul skills, the deep capacities that some individuals carry as part of their fundamental nature rather than as learned abilities. The research on this is contested, and the practical application, if it exists. has not been demonstrated under conditions the conservatory considers rigorous. I include it here because it is the kind of thing that will interest certain readers considerably. Chapter 18. The Temple of the Open Mind. The Temple of the Open Mind is not one building. It is 5, connected by covered walkways and open courtyards that have accumulated over centuries of growth and repurposing and deliberate expansion into something that feels less like a constructed complex and more like a living thing that has been growing toward the light for a very long time. Each section has its own character. Walking through the complex from one end to the other takes approximately 20 minutes and passes through 5 completely different qualities of space. I did it a number of times. I found it worth the repetition each time. The halls of unbroken thought. The healing wing. Clean and calm in the way of medical spaces that have been designed by people who understand that the environment of healing is itself part of the treatment. The staff here are specialists in the psychic treatment of memory disorders, trauma, mental afflictions, and cognitive conditions that conventional medicine cannot address. The waiting areas on the days I visited held people from at least 6 different regions of the Flaking Realms, most of them looking the particular combination of exhausted and hopeful that characterizes people who have traveled a significant distance to receive care that is not available closer to home. The halls are where the cases of returned children are documented and assessed. I did not raise this with the staff directly, having already discussed it with the Together party source and read the relevant research notes. What I will say is that the documentation I accessed was thorough, carefully maintained, and written in the language of people who are fully aware of what they are observing and have made a considered decision about what to do with that awareness. Whether that decision is defensible is a question I have already addressed in Part 3. The Vault of Recollection. The Direct Knowledge Transfer Wing operates on a waiting list that runs to several months, which tells you what you need to know about demand. The service, the installation of specific information or skills into a willing mind through combined psychic and divine means, is the temple's most sought-after offering and its most carefully controlled one. The process requires extended preparation of the recipient, the physical presence of a senior temple practitioner, and a significant fee. I was not on the waiting list and did not attempt to join it. I note it primarily so that readers who require this specific service understand that it exists, that it is genuine, and that planning for the wait time is not optional. The Sanctuary of Arborea. The portal chamber is at the center of the complex, which feels architecturally appropriate for something that is literally the center of the temple's spiritual significance. The approach to it is marked by a gradual change in the quality of the light warmer, with a particular quality of aliveness that I associate with the presence of significant divine working. I was not permitted to enter the chamber. The outer door, a carved arch of pale stone that stands open onto a short corridor leading to the chamber itself, was as close as I was allowed, and the temple staff who guided me were courteous and absolute about this. The reasons are practical, and I understand them. Portals to other planes are genuinely dangerous to approach without preparation, and Arborea is not a realm that welcomes casual visitors. It is a divine afterlife, among other things, and the gods and their servants who inhabit it do not look kindly on the merely curious passing through their domain for the experience of having done so. I could see into the chamber from the corridor. I will not pretend I looked away. The light inside is unlike any light I have encountered in 40 years of travel. It is not bright. It is not overwhelming. It is simply more present than light usually is, as though it is aware of being looked at and is making a reasonable effort to be seen clearly. Bryn Asheville walked through that portal, she told me, more times than she could count, and found it affecting every time. Having seen the light from the corridor, I believe her entirely. I also, to be honest, considered whether I could afford the gold and the convincing that might get me inside. I decided against it. This volume is about Rowan. Arborea is another book, for another time if the gods will permit the inquiry. The Temple of the Open Mind, proper. The Testing and Identification Wing handles the question that brings most people to it. Do I have psychic capacity? And if so, what kind and how much? The practitioners here are specialists in the assessment of latent and expressed psychic ability. The testing is not painful. It is not invasive in any way that a willing participant would find objectionable. It is, by the accounts of multiple people I spoke with who had been through it, a somewhat disorienting experience of being very thoroughly understood by people who are professionally calibrated to understand you. The Stillwater Sanctum. I will be brief here because what I want to say about this space does not benefit from elaboration. It is a room of statues and silence, and soft light from sources I did not identify. The statues represent gods and historical figures significant to the city and to Ogma's tradition of knowledge and honest inquiry, and they have been carved with the quality of attention that the city's craftspeople bring to everything. I sat there on 3 separate occasions during my stay. Each time I came in carrying something, the weight of the research, the accumulation of difficult things I had spent the day reading and thinking about, and each time I came out carrying somewhat less of it. I do not have a good explanation for this. It felt like having been in the presence of something that was not going to tell you what to do with what you know, but was, in the meantime, entirely capable of keeping you company while you figured it out. I recommend it without reservation to every visitor regardless of faith, affiliation, or purpose. It is free, it requires no appointment, and it is one of the best things in the city. Chapter 19. The Covered Lantern. The Covered Lantern is in the southern quarter, set slightly back from the main waterway in a manner that suggests either deliberate discretion or the particular luck of having been built before the waterway was planned, and which in either case results in an approach that feels like finding something rather than arriving at it. The sign, one of the very few signs in a city that does not use them, is small and carved rather than painted, the letters worn smooth by years of weather in the way of signs on buildings that have been standing long enough to develop a relationship with the climate. The rooms. The rooms are smaller than comparable establishments elsewhere, but the smallness is irrelevant because of what has been done with the walls. Every surface is lined with sound-dampening material, layers of treated fabric and compressed material that absorb sound in a way you feel as a kind of physical release when you first enter. You can whisper in these rooms. This sounds like a small thing. After 4 days in a city where any vocal sound in a public space produces the particular psychic attention described elsewhere in this volume, being able to whisper in your own room is not a small thing. It is the recovery of something you did not know you had lost. The talking room. In the basement, at the end of a short corridor that the proprietors will direct you to upon request, is a room available for hire by the hour that is the most thoroughly sound-isolated space I have encountered outside of magically sealed vaults. Inside, you may speak at full volume. You may argue. You may laugh loudly. You may cry in the manner of someone who has been holding something for 4 days and has finally found a space where letting it go is safe. I used this room for most of my research interviews. I also used it on 2 evenings simply to talk to myself, to process what I had been learning, to argue with my own notes, to say out loud the things that had been accumulating since I arrived, and that needed to be spoken rather than written before I could think about them clearly. The Covered Lantern is the only place in this city where I could practice it. The proprietors, and what they stand for. The proprietors have asked not to be named, and I have honored that request. What I will say is that they have been operating this establishment for over 20 years with a specific intention that goes beyond hospitality. The Covered Lantern is the city's gathering point for the people the city does not fully accommodate, the common folk. The visitors, the people performing belonging so thoroughly that they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. The proprietors understand this because they have lived it, and they have built a space that addresses it as directly as anything can be directly addressed in a city of this nature. They support the Together Party. They do not advertise this, but they do not hide it, and they speak about it in the quiet way that people speak about things they have decided are worth the risk of speaking about. Sidebar: what is under the city? A brief detour beneath Rowan. I went down. This will surprise no one who has read the preceding chapters. The cavern system beneath Rowan is the same system that sheltered the survivors of the Clatter's destruction. The tunnels and chambers where 4,000 people spent 48 years building a new society in the dark. Some of the original structures from that period are still visible in the upper cavern levels. Carved chambers with smooth walls, old fire pits long cold, markings in a gestural language that the current city's residents can still read, and that represent, I was told by a researcher who had studied them, a combination of practical instruction and emotional record left by people who expected to die underground and wanted to leave something behind. The deeper caverns are a different matter. The slimes that occupy them are the source of the soft white coating that defines Rowan's streets and buildings, the material that gives the city its particular yield underfoot, its sound-dampening quality, the distinctive texture that travelers notice and cannot quite name. The slimes are native to these caverns and appear to have been present long before the human and flower-borne occupation. The material they produce as a byproduct of their natural processes was noticed by the early settlers as having unusual properties when combined with certain porous volcanic stones. Applied as a liquid and allowed to cure, it produces a material that is simultaneously structural, sound-dampening, and possessed of the faint-giving quality that makes Rowan's streets feel different from any other cities. The porous volcanic stone comes from a neighboring kingdom that currently supplies it as a means of disposing of quarry rubble for a modest income. That kingdom is, as far as I can determine, entirely unaware of what the rubble becomes. Deeper still are the grell, floating creatures of significant psychic appetite that produce a constant low-level sound and feed on psychic energy. They would, left to their own devices, be a significant problem for a city built on psychic capacity. They are not left to their own devices. The slimes eat them. The grell keep the slimes fed. The slimes produce the building material. The building material defines the city. The city was built on what the caverns provided, in ways that go considerably deeper than the founding mythology acknowledges. The communication party is currently working to determine whether the slime material can be exported at scale. The volcanic stone supplier finding out what their rubble is worth is, I was told, a negotiation the city would prefer to control the timing of. I found this entirely reasonable and have therefore described it in a widely distributed publication. I trust the communication party will manage accordingly. Chapter 20. The Flowerborn District. The fence is elegant. This is the first thing I want to say about it, because it would be easy to describe a fence as a blunt instrument, and this one is not. It is iron worked into forms that suggest growth rather than containment, flowering shapes at the posts. The bars curved in ways that echo the organic geometry of the buildings within, and it is beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been made by people who believe in what they are making. The message it carries, "This is not for you," is delivered in the same pristine aesthetic language as everything else in Rowan. The city does not make ugly things, even the ones whose purpose is to exclude. What can be seen from outside? The streets inside the district follow the same soft-tiled design as the rest of the city. The architecture is similar in its broad character, but softer in its details. The angles less severe, the proportions more generous, built for people who experience the world at a frequency that benefits from space and light, and the absence of hard edges. At the district's center, visible from the fence on clear days, the fountain moves water in a way I have not seen water moved anywhere else. It descends without sound, the flow guided along channels so precisely carved that the water moves from level to level without splash, without trickle, without the small, constant negotiations with gravity that produce noise in every other fountain I have encountered. It simply moves, silently, as though water had agreed to behave differently here as a courtesy to the people who live nearby. On the afternoon of my second day, observing from the fence, it began to rain. The district emptied in moments, not in the hurried, shelter-seeking way that people respond to rain in cities without adequate cover, but in the smooth, unhurried way of people executing a well-practiced response to a familiar condition. The windows lit from within. The streets were empty. The rain fell on unoccupied tiles, and the sound of it, muffled and distant through the fence and the distance, was the only noise the district produced. Inside. I will not describe how I entered the district. I will say that I was inside it for approximately 4 hours across 2 separate visits, that I was not, to my knowledge, detected during either visit, and that I observed nothing that warranted the alarm my presence would have caused if discovered. What I found was a neighborhood. This sounds insufficient given the weight that has accumulated around the district in the preceding chapters, but it is the accurate description. A neighborhood of people living with a vulnerability they have built their entire world around protecting, and the world they have built is beautiful and functional and deeply, quietly human in all the ways that matter. The streets within are quieter than the rest of a city that is itself already silent. Breathing feels loud here. I became aware of my own footfalls in a way I was not elsewhere in the city. The construction. On my second visit, I noticed, at the district's western edge, active construction. New buildings going up at the boundary, the district expanding, slowly and carefully. The construction was conducted in complete silence, the workers operating under combined silence and wall of stone effects, shaping the raw material into forms using mold earth and similar workings, then applying the slime coating that produces the city's distinctive soft stone finish with tools that made no sound I could detect. The expansion of the flower-born district is not something that appears in the civic records I accessed through official channels. It is simply happening, quietly, at the edges of the most protected space in a city built on protection. The light show, from inside. On my second night inside the district, I was present when a light show began. I had seen them from the city streets before. The rising luminescence above the district's roofline, the collective psychic expression of grief and gratitude, beautiful from the outside in the way that anything large and luminous in a dark sky is beautiful. I had written about them in the chapter guide with what I believed was adequate description. I had been wrong. From inside the district, the light shows are not a display. They are a mural. The lights rise and move and configure themselves with a precision that is not visible from the streets below, where the angles flatten the composition into something simply luminous. From inside, from the right position, they form images. Not abstract patterns, images. Specific, particular, composed with the care of someone who has spent years thinking about exactly what they want people to see. The show I watched that night depicted a life. A flower-born woman who had died that day had spent the last years of her life working with a group of artists and friends on the exact composition of what would be displayed when she was gone. The lights formed her face, held it for long enough that everyone watching could memorize it, and then moved through a sequence of images that I understood, even without knowing her, as the shape of her particular existence. Something that looked like the conservatory where she had worked. Something that looked like children, several of them her family. Something that looked like a specific waterway, perhaps one she had walked daily. Something abstract and beautiful that I could not interpret, and that felt, for that reason, most intimate of all, the part of a person that is only fully known to them. The show lasted 23 minutes. When it ended, the district was dark and still, and the silence that followed had a different quality than the silence that had preceded it, fuller, somehow, as though it had just absorbed something significant and was still in the process of holding it. I sat on the soft tiles of a street I was not supposed to be on and did not move for a long time. Chapter 21. The city as a whole. On my last full day in Row, I walked every major waterway from source to end. I had done this twice before during my stay, once in the first week when I was still mapping the city's physical layout, and once in the 5th week when I was beginning to understand what the layout meant. This final walk was different from both of those. I was not learning anything. I was simply walking through a place I had come to know. What the silence did. I am a loud person. I talk to myself when I work. I sing when I am walking alone on roads between cities, badly, enthusiastically, in a manner that has alarmed several generations of wildlife across 3 continents. I am someone who processes the world partly through sound, through the production of it as much as the reception of it, and the prospect of 2 months in a city that treats that processing as a disruption was something I had approached with a certain amount of professional resignation. What I did not anticipate was that the city would change what I wanted. It happened gradually. The first week I spent significant time in the talking room of the covered lantern, using it as a pressure release valve. The second week I still went, but found I needed less time. By the fourth week, I was going once and spending part of that time simply sitting in the silence of a room designed for noise, not filling it. What was replacing the sound was not its absence. It was something else. The city communicates with a directness that verbal language, in my experience, rarely achieves. The sly comment made sideways. The thing said through laughter to soften it. The observation delivered as a question to avoid the vulnerability of stating it plainly. I do all of these things constantly. In Rowan, through the apparatus, through the written notes, through the particular quality of psychic communication translated into language, none of those sideways approaches were available to me. On my last full day, walking the waterways, I found that I was not filling the silence. I was simply walking through a place I had come to know, in quiet, and the quiet felt like mine rather than like something imposed on me. Rowan did not make me different. It made me aware of what I was. I am genuinely uncertain whether that is a gift or a warning, and I think it might be both, and I think that might be the most honest thing I have said about the city in this entire volume. The towers at dusk. On the evening of my last full day, the towers caught the light in the way that I had noticed on my first afternoon, and had continued to notice every evening since, the dark blue glass holding the sunset in ways that ordinary windows do not. The city moved below the towers in its usual way. Silent, purposeful, beautiful in the specific manner of something that has been refined over 2 centuries into exactly the shape it intends to be. I stood in the street and watched it for a long time. Then I went back to the covered lantern and had the tea and thought about what I was going to write. The next morning I left for the surrounding city-states to find the people who had left Rowan behind. A city that has made peace with what it ISIS the most beautiful kind. It is also, sometimes, the most dangerous. End of Part 4. Part 5. The Silent Plains. I have been putting off writing this part. I want to be honest about that because I think the honesty is relevant. I spent 2 months in Rowan and 2 weeks in the surrounding region, and then I spent 3 weeks traveling between cities composing the preceding 4 parts of this volume before I sat down to write what follows. This is not my usual practice. I typically write in sequence, section by section, as the material is still fresh. I did not do that here. The material in this part has not stopped being fresh. That is the problem. Chapter 22. The plains themselves. The silent plains begin where the orchards end, and the orchards end gradually enough that there is no clean line between cultivated and wild. The fruit trees thin out over the course of perhaps half a mile, becoming more widely spaced, less tended, their lower branches showing the evidence of animals that have been browsing them. And then you notice that the animals have stopped, and the birds have stopped, and the only movement in the trees ahead is the trees themselves in the wind, and you understand that you have crossed a threshold that nothing living crosses casually. The landscape is not dramatic. The silent plains are hilled, gently, in the rolling way of land that has been shaped by water over long periods of time. The rivers that run through them are slow and wide, moving with the particular unhurried confidence of water that has nowhere urgent to be. The trees are old and dense, and in the season I visited were carrying fruit that nobody was harvesting, stone fruits, and something I did not recognize with a deep blue skin and a smell like honey left in the sun. It is beautiful. I want to say that too, with the same clarity, because the beauty matters for understanding what it means that this place exists in its current form. The rivers and what lives in them. The rivers of the silent plains carry fish, which I had not expected. Life adapts to conditions with the patient indifference of something that has no awareness of adapting. It simply survives, or it does not. And the things that survive are the things that found a way. The fish in the silent plains rivers have, over the generations since the creatures arrived, developed a behavior that I observed for approximately an hour from a riverbank before I understood what I was seeing. They float. Not all the time they swim in the normal fashion of fish when the water requires it. But when a creature is near, the fish go still. They drift with the current. They become, to every sense available to the creatures, logs. Generation after generation, the fish that learned to go still when stillness was required left more offspring than the fish that did not. The ones I watched were very good at it. I found this more affecting than I had anticipated. The fish do not know what they are doing or why. They are simply what survival made them. Spending time in the plains. I spent 4 days in the Silent Plains across 2 separate visits. I am a cautious traveler with significant magical resources available to me, including the capacity to remove myself from any situation that becomes genuinely dangerous faster than any creature I have yet encountered can prevent. And I treated the plains with the respect that anything capable of killing a person without warning deserves. What required adjustment was the duration. 4 days of sustained silence, including the particular discipline of not speaking aloud in the moments when speaking aloud is instinctive, which is to say all of them. On the morning of my second day, I found a man. He was living in a structure built between 2 large trees at the edge of a river, a shelter assembled with the particular ingenuity of someone who has been solving the same practical problems for a long time, and has arrived at solutions that work rather than solutions that look like they should work. He was old. He had the look of someone who had made peace with his circumstances so thoroughly that the circumstances had stopped being circumstances and had become simply life. He saw me coming from a distance, and his expression communicated with perfect clarity that I was a problem he had not planned for this morning. He gestured at me to stop. Then he gestured at a space approximately 15 feet to my left. Then he stood completely still. I stood completely still. The creature that passed between us was not visible. Its presence was legible from the way the grass moved in a pattern inconsistent with the wind and from a faint distortion in the air above the river. The man waited until it had moved well past us. Then he looked at me, communicated through expression and gesture that I was in his forest, and he would appreciate it if I left before I attracted something he would have to deal with, and went back inside his shelter. I left him to it. He is a footnote in this volume because the world is full of people who have made specific and personal arrangements with the circumstances they find themselves in, and the world is better for containing them. I hope he is well. The orchards at the edge. The fruit that Rowan's economy depends on is harvested from orchards that sit at the boundary between the cultivated land closer to the city and the wilder territory of the plains proper. The harvest is conducted in organized silence by teams from the city, working in the particular coordinated efficiency of people who communicate entirely without words. I watched a harvest team work for approximately 2 hours. One member of the team dropped a tool, a short metal implement that struck a stone and produced a sound that was not loud by any ordinary standard but was loud enough. The team froze. All of them, simultaneously, without signal, in the practiced way of people running a well-rehearsed protocol. They stood still for perhaps 4 minutes. Then the member who had dropped the tool picked it up and the team resumed work as though nothing had happened. I noted the location of where the portal is said to discharge the children each year. Or rather, I attempted to note it. I spent the better part of a day searching the area where the city's records suggested the portal opens, looking for any evidence of what happens there annually, physical markings, residue, anything that would serve as a record of the event. I found nothing. The creatures are thorough in ways that are efficient and final and leave no evidence for a researcher to examine. Chapter 23. The creatures. I saw 6 noise eaters during my 4 days in the plains. Possibly more. The translucent quality of their form means that one moving through landscape at a distance is genuinely difficult to distinguish from a distortion of light or a trick of the air. The 6 I am confident about I observed at ranges between 30 and 200 feet, for periods ranging from a few minutes to the better part of an hour, under conditions that allowed me to take detailed notes. Form and movement. The creatures are not invisible in the technical sense. They are translucent. Their bodies exist in a state between full material presence and something else, a quality that makes them nearly impossible to see against complex backgrounds like foliage or moving water, but detectable against plain surfaces or open sky, if you know what to look for. Spells designed to reveal invisible things do not work on them, because they are not invisible in the way those spells address. What does work is anything that coats or marks surfaces, color, powder, liquid, which adheres to their form and renders them visible for as long as it remains. They can shed this marking by passing briefly through what I believe is the astral plane, a transit that takes them out of material existence for a moment and returns them to it clean. This ability requires recovery time before it can be used again. They are fluid in form, Not shapeless, exactly, but not fixed. Moving, they flow around obstacles with the quality of water finding the path of least resistance, passing through gaps as narrow as an inch. They can move extraordinarily fast when motivated, covering ground at a speed that makes pursuit or flight a serious consideration. They are also, when not engaged, surprisingly still. I observed one near a river for 40 minutes during which it did not move at all, simply occupied a space, doing nothing visible, with the perfect patience of something that does not experience boredom, because it does not experience time the way living things do. Hunting and feeding. The creatures hunt by sound. What is less widely documented is the specificity of what sounds they respond to and which they do not. Environmental noise does not trigger them. Wind, water, the movement of branches, the settling of earth, these produce vibrations that the creatures can detect and consistently choose to ignore. I observed a storm front move through the plains on my third day, producing significant wind and rain noise, and the creatures I was tracking did not respond to it in any way that suggested alarm or hunting behavior. They know the difference between the world making noise and something alive making noise. What they respond to is the sound of living things, and specifically, I observed, sounds associated with distress or alarm. They eat fallen fruit that has hit the ground with enough impact to produce sound, and fish that make too much noise in the river. The hermit I encountered had clearly made peace with the particular choreography of living alongside things that respond to every sound you make with potential lethal interest. He had been doing it long enough to be calm about it. In combat, I will be transparent about the fact that my observations of the creatures in active combat posture come from a controlled context. I produced a deliberate noise at a sufficient distance that I could observe the response and remove myself before it escalated to contact. I did not engage one directly. This was a research visit, not a combat exercise. What I observed was this: the creatures commit to a form when they attack. The fluid quality of their movement resolves, in the moment of engagement, into something more structured. A jaw configuration that locks onto a target with a grip that the conservatory's documentation describes as requiring significant force to break, and a body that configures into either a spiked form for rapid damage or a tentacled form for sustained grappling and consumption. They can take considerable punishment before being disabled. Their distributed form means that conventional strikes land without the clean impact that disables a body with concentrated vital points. What works against them is precision and persistence. The Royal Guard, I was told by a source who had observed them in operation, is very good at both. What they should not be. Here is the thing about noise eaters that I kept returning to during my 4 days in the plains. They do not behave like natural predators. Natural predators have economies. They balance the expenditure of energy against the return of food, and they have learned, over generations, which targets are worth pursuing and which are not. They rest. They have territories with centers and edges. They are, in short, comprehensible as living things navigating the problem of staying alive. The noise eaters are not comprehensible in this way. They stand still for hours without feeding. They respond to sounds that are too small to represent viable food with the same oriented attention they give to sounds that are. They move in patterns that suggest coverage of an area rather than the organic patrol of a predator tracking prey. The population of noise eaters in the Silent Plains and surrounding region is, by every account I have gathered, significantly larger than any natural predator ecology in a comparable space could sustain. There is not enough prey in the plains to feed the creature population that exists there. They should not be as numerous as they are. They should not have appeared as suddenly as they did, fully formed and perfectly adapted to their hunting method, without any fossil or archaeological record of predecessors. Natural things evolve. They leave traces of having evolved. The noise eaters have no such traces. They are exactly what they are, and they have always been exactly what they are. And when I sat with that fact in the middle of the plains on my last evening there, watching one of them stand motionless beside a river for the 47th minute, I found it the most unsettling thing about them. Not the hunting, not the killing, the stillness. The absolute, patient, purposeful stillness of something that is waiting, because it was made to wait. Chapter 24. What happens to the children? Content warning: this chapter contains explicit description of what occurs when children are sent to the Silent Plains. It includes accounts of injury and death and material that readers will find deeply distressing. It is written this way deliberately. The warning in red ink is a signal to read carefully rather than a permission to skip. The author asks that you read it. Let me tell you about Rowan first. Let me remind you of what it is before I tell you what it does. Rowan has the lowest crime rate in the Flaking Realms. It has eliminated poverty within its borders through a mutual obligation economy that functions because its citizens are constitutionally incapable of deceiving each other about need. It has the Quayandia Conservatory, which leads the world in psychic research and produces magical items of a quality and affordability that no comparable institution can match. It has the Temple of the Open Mind, which heals things that cannot be healed elsewhere, which maintains one of only 2 known portals to Arborea, which offers its Stillwater sanctum freely to anyone who walks through its doors regardless of faith or affiliation. It has the Halls of Unbroken Thought, where specialists in the psychic treatment of memory and trauma work with patients who have traveled from across the Flaking Realms because what they need cannot be found closer to home. It has researchers who have spent careers understanding exactly how psychic capacity works at a fundamental level, how it is inherited, how it can be developed, how its absence in some individuals relates to its presence in others. It has the Vault of Recollection. It has information siphons that can teach a person everything a master craftsperson knew in a single moment of application. It has all of this. Hold that in mind for what comes next. The numbers. Each year in Rowan, approximately 5,000 children reach the age of 5. Of those, the testing administered by practitioners of the Temple of the Open Mind identifies approximately 150 who lack sufficient psychic capacity to meet the city's citizenship threshold. These children are gathered. They are brought to a portal. They are sent through it into the Silent Plains. Approximately 3 return each year. 3 out of 150. I want to let that number sit on the page for a moment before I continue, because I think it deserves the space. 3 children out of every 150 sent into a creature-patrolled wilderness at the age of 5. A 2% survival rate. For children. For 5-year-olds who have done nothing except fail a test. What happens when the portal opens? The portal opens in the plains at a location that changes each year. I could not find the location of this year's opening despite significant effort. The creatures are thorough. The children who come through have grown up in Rowan. Many of them have never been outside the city. They have grown up in the softest, quietest, most carefully sound-managed environment in the Flaking Realms, in a city where every adult in their life has communicated with them primarily through psychic link and apparatus and gesture, where loud noise has been not merely discouraged, but treated as a genuine harm. They are 5 years old, and they have been told, in the careful way that the city's testing process is described to families, that this is part of how children become citizens. What they have not been told, what their parents, in many cases, also have not been told with sufficient clarity to understand, is what the plains are, not the folk tale version, the real version. The one where the creatures are everywhere and invisible and respond to sound with the immediate efficiency of things that were designed for exactly this. The portal opens and 150 children arrive in the Silent Plains. Some of them are quiet. Some of them have the particular quality of children who have grown up in a psychic city and have learned, almost by absorption, that silence is the baseline. These children have a chance. A small one, but a chance. The others, the children who are frightened, who are disoriented, who arrive through a magical portal into an unfamiliar landscape and respond the way frightened 5-year-olds respond, which is to say loudly, do not have a chance. They have the duration between the sound they make and the moment the creatures find them, which is not long. There are always some who cry on arrival. There are always some who call for parents who are not there. The crying draws the creatures. The creatures respond with the speed I observed in the plains and the efficiency I described in the preceding chapter. The ones who are struck, and being struck, for a 5-year-old, means something different than it means for the Royal Guard members who train against these things make more noise. More noise draws more creatures. The cascade is rapid. This is what happens in the first minutes. I am describing it plainly because it is what happens, and because I believe the people of Rowan who vote for the council members who maintain this system have, most of them, not thought about what happens in the first minutes. They have thought about the testing protocol as a policy. A policy is an abstraction. What I am describing is not an abstraction. The survivors. The children who survive the first minute survive through stillness. Some achieve it instinctively, the quiet ones, the ones who have absorbed the city's silence deeply enough that their first response to fear is to go still and wait rather than to make noise. Some achieve it through the particular coldness that extreme shock sometimes produces in people, of any age, who have encountered something so far outside their experience that the normal responses simply fail to activate. They then have to survive the plains, for days, alone or in the small groups that form when children who are both quiet and competent find each other. They need water, which the rivers provide if approached with sufficient care. They need food, which the fruit trees provide if they can reach them. They need to navigate back toward the city. They are 5 years old. They are doing this in the silent plains. The ones who make it back, the 3, on average, out of every 150 are psychic. Every one of them. This is the city's stated purpose of the test, to identify psychic children who have not yet manifested. The city points to this as evidence that the test works. The city does not point to the 147. The outrage I am no longer able to contain. I have been a professional observer for 40 years. I have written about things that disturbed me with the measured language of someone committed to giving their readers the information and trusting them to feel what they feel about it. I am going to abandon that practice for the remainder of this section because I find I cannot maintain it, and I am no longer certain I should. Rowan has the conservatory. It has researchers who understand the psychic genome at a level that would have been unimaginable to the founders of this city. It has the vault of recollection. It has information siphons. It has practitioners in the temple of the open mind who can read the psychic capacity of a person with a precision that I was told, by multiple sources, can identify latent ability that has not yet expressed, the very ability that the testing protocol is supposedly trying to find. The testing protocol sends children into creature territory to see which ones come back psychic. The temple can identify latent psychic ability directly. These two facts exist simultaneously in the same city. I have been sitting with this for weeks, and I have not found a version of it that is not an indictment. There are other options. There have always been other options. Expanded testing windows that allow for later developing ability. Direct identification of latent capacity through the tools the conservatory has already developed. Even, in the worst case, exiled the simple removal of non-psychic children from the city without sending them into creature territory. Any of these would produce the city's stated goal, which is a psychic population, without the 147. The city does not do any of these things. The city has had a century of blooming party governance and access to research that could have changed the testing protocol at any point during that century, and the testing protocol has not changed. Fiendcours told me the system is imperfect and that they do not have a perfect alternative to offer. The conservatory's researchers have a perfect alternative, multiple ones. They are sitting in the research notes that I was not supposed to read and that I read anyway, and they have been there for years, and no one has implemented them. A civilization built on honest communication and mutual understanding, and the absolute impossibility of deception, has decided that the correct response to a non-psychic 5-year-old is to send them to die in a field. That is what I am saying. I am saying it plainly, and I want it to sit in the same volume as the Stillwater Sanctum and the light shows and the tea at the covered lantern, because they are all true about the same place, and the distance between them is the most important thing I have found to say about Rowan in 2 months of looking. The returned children and what they carry. The children who come back are changed. The conservatory has documented this, acknowledged by the temple's practitioners in research records that describe consistent psychic blocks across all returned children regardless of individual experience. I want to be precise about what consistent means in this context. Trauma produces varied psychological responses. Different people subjected to different versions of the same terrible experience develop different adaptations. The variation is part of what makes trauma legible as trauma. It bears the fingerprints of the specific person and the specific experience. What the returned children carry is not this. The blocks in returned children are identical. Child to child, year to year, across decades of documentation. The same structure, the same placement, the same particular quality of something that has been put there rather than grown there, covering the same content with the same thoroughness, in a way that the temple's practitioners consistently describe as beyond their capacity to address without engaging with whatever created the block in the first place. One practitioner, speaking to me anonymously, said, "Whatever made these does not want them undone. I am not equipped to argue with whatever made these." I noted the phrasing and asked what they meant by whatever. They declined to continue. I approached Bryn Asheville with this finding. She listened. She asked one question about the specific structure of the blocks, in the precise language of someone who recognized what she was hearing. She declined to comment further. She did not look surprised. What I can demonstrate: the blocks are consistent, deliberate in structure, and resistant to divine intervention in ways that suggest the involvement of something with divine or near-divine capacity. The children are returning from the plains changed in ways that go beyond what the creatures could produce. Something in the plains has an interest in the children who survive it, and that interest has left a mark. What I am choosing not to say in full: the specific nature of what I believe was offered to those children, and what they agreed to in exchange for the ability to come home. I have reasons for this restraint that I will explain in the interlude that follows this chapter. What I will say, plainly and for the record: Rowan's leadership should know, if they do not already know, that the testing protocol is not sending children into the plains and filtering them through danger. It is sending children into the range of something that has an active interest in them. The city's continued use of the plains as a testing ground is not a neutral policy decision. It is a decision made in proximity to something that the city's most powerful divine practitioner, a 200-year-old cleric of Ogma who has walked through the Arborea portal more times than she can count, went quiet about when I raised it with her. That is what I know. That is what I am saying. The rest is for someone better equipped than I am to address. Interlude. A direct address to the reader. I need to explain something before Part 5 continues. I have spent 40 years arguing, in print and in practice, that the truth is the most important thing there is. I have burned a king's reputation with it. I have published research notes I was not supposed to have read. I have written things that made powerful people very angry, and I have done so without hesitation, on the grounds that the discomfort of the powerful is not a reason to leave the truth unspoken. I am withholding something from this volume. I want to tell you that directly, because I think you have earned the honesty, and because the withholding is itself a kind of information that you deserve to have. What I know and what I am not publishing in full, the nature of what was offered to the surviving children in the plains, what they agreed to, what the marks they carry represent in the specific vocabulary of divine and infernal obligation. I have enough to state this with confidence. I am not stating it in full. Here is why. The children who came back from the plains are now adults living their lives in Rowan, in other cities, across the Flaking Realms. Many of them have families. Many of them have no memory of what happened to them and no framework for understanding what the marks in their minds represent. Publishing the full account of what I believe those marks are would reach their families before it reached them. It would reach Rowan's neighboring city-states, who depend on the city's creature management, and who would have to immediately assess what it means that some of the city's residents carry obligations of the specific kind I am describing. It would reach people who are not prepared for it, in ways that would cause harm that I cannot contain or mitigate from a distance. I have never made this calculation before in 40 years of writing. I have always come down on the side of the truth getting out. I am not certain I am right to come down differently now. I am certain that I have thought about it carefully and that I cannot see a path from full disclosure to a better situation for the people most directly affected. What I will say, and what I am saying directly to anyone in Rowan's leadership who reads this volume, change the system. Not because I am asking you to, because something in the plains is waiting for you to keep sending children into it, and whatever it wants from them it is patient enough to wait for, and you do not know the full nature of what you are cooperating with. I know more than I am publishing. What I am publishing should be enough. The next chapter covers the people who have left Rowan. Some of them are the adults who were sent into the plains as children and came back. Their memories are returning. I have spoken with them. What follows is what they told me, and what I observed in them, and what I think it means. GKS. Chapter 25. The people who left. The surrounding city-states are, in aggregate, a portrait of what Rowan looks like from outside its walls. They are cities that have made their accommodations with the creature threat, that have built their economies around the trade, relationships the city offers, that have quiet and consistent opinions about their neighbor that they express in the careful language of people who understand exactly what expressing those opinions loudly would cost them. They also contain, in numbers I had not expected, former residents of Rowan. I spent 2 weeks talking to them. What follows is a representative account. Those who left without looking back. The majority of the former residents I spoke with left Rowan for reasons that require no particular investigation. One was a mixed woman of perhaps 50 who had grown up in the city, built a career in the creature training operation, and left at 32 when an opportunity arose in a neighboring city-state to establish her own facility. She spoke about Rowan with the fond pragmatism of someone who grew up somewhere and moved away when the right thing came along. She missed the silence occasionally. She did not miss the apparatus. There was nothing complicated in her account, and I include it here because most people who leave places leave for reasons like hers, and the weight of the other accounts should not obscure the fact that some departures are simply departures. Another was a flower-born man of 28, near the end of his life by his people's measure, who had left the city at 19 to pursue an ambition that required more room than Rowan could give it. He would not specify the ambition. He was 9 years into it and appeared to be progressing. He spoke about the city with genuine love and no apparent regret. He was going to die outside it, he said, which was fine, because the point was never to die somewhere in particular. The point was to finish the thing. I wished him good fortune with the thing. He thanked me and paid for both our meals, which I had not expected and found affecting. Those who could not stay. A mixed man in his 40s had left 12 years ago after a friend's child was sent to the plains and came back wrong. He used that word specifically, wrong, and elaborated carefully on what it meant. The child was present, functional, psychic, integrated into the city without apparent difficulty. And wrong. A quality to the child's attention that he could read, as a psychic, as something that was not quite the child he had known before. Something adjacent to the child. Something that had moved into the space the child occupied while the child was away and had not entirely moved out. He had tried to raise this with the child's parents. They did not want to hear it. He had left 6 months later, understanding that his own continued presence in the city required him to either stop noticing what he was noticing or stop saying what he was noticing, and he found he could do neither. Those who were asked to leave. 2 former residents I spoke with had been what one of them cheerfully described as asked to take their particular energy elsewhere. One was a common folk woman who had lived in Rowan for 8 years and had been, by her own account, consistently too loud, too resistant to the apparatus discipline, and too vocal about her opinions on the child testing to be considered a comfortable presence. She had been asked to leave through the particular Rowan method of asking, a series of increasingly pointed psychic communications from sound wardens, a visit from someone she was fairly sure was a High Guard member, and a very direct conversation with the covered lantern proprietors who, while sympathetic, suggested she consider whether she had found her natural limit. She found this extremely funny when recounting it. She bore the city no ill will. She simply did not agree with its premises and had gone somewhere that did not require her to. The ones whose memories are returning. I want to approach this section carefully. The people I am about to describe are living their lives. They have, in most cases, built things outside Rowan, relationships, work, a sense of themselves that does not depend on understanding what happened to them as children. The memories returning are not, from the accounts I gathered, traumatic in the immediate physical sense. They are disorienting. They arrive as impressions before they arrive as images. A feeling of presence, a sense of obligation that has no object, a lean towards certain kinds of choices or away from others that the person cannot account for and in some cases has not yet connected to anything. I spoke with 4 people who I believe are former returned children, now adults ranging from their 20s to their 40s, whose memories of the plains are sharpening as they move further from the city and longer from the event. What they remember, in fragments and impressions, a presence, something that was not the creatures, something that found them when they had gotten far enough from the chaos of arrival, something that offered them something. Something that changed them in a way they can feel at the edges of the change, like a scar you can trace with your fingers without being able to see it in a mirror. The inflections they describe, the leanings, the pulls, the sense of being guided away from home and toward something that does not yet have a clear form, are consistent across all 4 accounts. Something is patient. Something is waiting for them to move far enough and remember clearly enough to understand what they agreed to. I do not believe they are in immediate danger. I believe they are in a relationship with something that has a long timeline and is not in a hurry. I have not told them what I know about what that relationship is. This is the second editorial decision in this volume that has cost me something. I have left them, each of them, with a way to reach me if the memories sharpen further. 2 of them have already written. I have answered. I am aware that the decision to withhold information from people who have a right to it, on the grounds that the timing of disclosure matters, is exactly the kind of decision I have spent 40 years criticizing in institutions and governments. I am sitting with the irony. I do not have a resolution to it. I have only the specific circumstances and the specific people and the specific calculation that I made and am continuing to make. I will be wrong or I will be right. I will find out. The world is full of things that are patient. Patience is not the same as benign, but it is not the same as malicious either. The difference matters, and I do not yet know which this is. End of Part 5. Part 6. Living with it. The preceding 5 parts of this volume were written about Rowan. This part is written from inside the experience of having written them, from the specific and strange position of someone who spent 2 months in a place, 2 weeks talking to people who left it, and then several more weeks sitting alone with everything those 2 months produced. It is the part I have been least certain how to write. I am writing it anyway, because the alternative is a book that tells you what I found without telling you what it did to me. And I have come to believe those 2 things cannot be properly separated when the subject is Rowan. This city does something to you. I want to account for what it did to me, because I think it is relevant to the 5 parts that preceded this one, and because honesty about the observer is part of honest observation. Chapter 26. What 2 months does to a person. I arrived in Rowan a loud person, and left it something more complicated than that. This is not a dramatic transformation. I want to be clear about that because I have read enough travel writing to know that the genre has a weakness for the profound personal change narrative. The traveler who goes somewhere and comes back entirely remade, which is almost never what actually happens, and which flattens what does happen into a shape that fits the story better than it fits the reality. What happened to me in Rowan was smaller and more specific than transformation. It was a shift in what I noticed, and a shift in what I wanted, and those 2 things compounding over 2 months into something that I am still, weeks later, trying to accurately describe. What the city gave me. Rowan is honest in a way that most cities are not and cannot be. This is not a moral observation about the character of its residents. It is a structural one about what psychic transparency produces in a community that has lived with it long enough to build a culture around it. The city does not hide what it is. Its governance runs in a circular chamber where every thought that enters the center platform is visible. Its enforcement walks in plain clothes because it does not need to announce itself. Its residents communicate with a directness that verbal language almost never achieves because the social performances that verbal language enables. The sideways comment, the thing said through laughter, the observation delivered as a question, never developed in people for whom the thought behind the word was always the more legible thing. Spending 2 months in the presence of that directness changed what I expected from communication. Not permanently. I am back to my usual habits, the songs on the road, the sly remarks, the verbal sparring. That is how I have always processed the world. But I notice them now in a way I did not before. I notice when I am saying something sideways that I could say directly. I notice the gap between the thing I am communicating and the thing I am technically saying, and I notice it as a choice rather than as a reflex. The flower-born who spoke with me in the padded room of the covered lantern, who gave me their complete and undivided attention without any part of their mind elsewhere, changed something in what I understood attention to mean. Something about being fully seen by another person, not assessed, not evaluated, simply seen, that reaches past the professional habits I have spent 40 years building and touches something that was there before all of it. What the city showed me about itself. The city does not hide its nature. You can observe Rowan clearly. You can walk its streets and attend its deliberations and read its research notes and speak with its residents and come away with an accurate picture of what it is. The city is not trying to deceive you. It is what it is, openly, and if you look at it clearly you will see both what it has achieved and what it has done to achieve it, because both of those things are present in the same spaces at the same time and neither one is hidden. Most cities that have done harm present themselves through a curated version of their history that softens or omits the harm. Row and psychic transparency makes this kind of curation essentially impossible internally. The residents know what their city is, and the knowledge is simply part of the texture of living there rather than a revelation that requires acknowledgement. The harm is known. The beauty is known. Both are known simultaneously and both are held as part of the same inheritance. As an outsider observing this, I found it, paradoxically, more disturbing than cities that hide their histories. A city that has concealed its harm has made a judgment that the harm is something to be ashamed of. Row, and has made no such judgment. On being dangerous. I want to note something practical before this chapter ends, because it is relevant to any traveler considering a visit, and because it is the kind of thing that only hints in the chapter guide. Rowan is genuinely dangerous in a way that is easy to underestimate precisely because the danger does not look like danger. There is no visible military. There are no soldiers in heavy armor on street corners. The city looks, to the eye of a traveler from most other places, like the safest urban environment they have encountered. Consider what 50 psychics in a street can do to a single target if they decide to. Mind sliver, cast by 50 people simultaneously at an unprepared target, is not a nuisance. It is not the mild headache described in Part 2's account of how the city manages disruptive visitors. It is the kind of psychic force that can stop a capable combatant in their tracks, disorient and disable someone with significant magical resistance, and kill someone with insufficient mental defenses in a matter of moments. The city contains 230,000 mixed residents and 14,000 flower-born, all of whom are psychic, most of whom are walking the same streets you are walking, none of whom are identifiable as threat until they have decided you are a threat and acted on that decision. There is no counter to this except mind blank or immediate departure. There is no fighting your way out of a city that fights with its mind. I am a person with significant magical resources, and I found Rowan, at certain moments, genuinely unnerving in this specific way, not because anyone threatened me. Because I understood, clearly, that the city's safety record does not come from goodwill alone, and that the goodwill has a hard edge underneath it that you would only encounter if you gave the city sufficient reason to show it to you. I did not give it that reason. I recommend this general approach. Chapter 27. The Final Accounting. Here is what Rowan is. It is a city built by people who survived something that should have destroyed them, through an alliance with other people who also should not have existed, in conditions that selected for exactly the qualities that the city now embodies. The silence is not an aesthetic preference. It is the accumulated survival instinct of a population whose ancestors learned that noise meant death, and passed that knowledge down through 2 centuries of living, until it became culture, architecture, governance, and the fundamental organizing principle of daily life. The psychic transparency is not a political philosophy. It is the natural expression of a community that developed in conditions where deception was impossible and honest communication was the only kind available. The city works because it is what it is, thoroughly and without apology. A cleric watching a druid cast their spells can see the beauty of what is happening, can follow the broad shape of the magic, can even name what school the effects belong to, and still cannot access the logic of how the druid draws upon the natural world, cannot feel the roots of it or understand the precise communion it requires. That is what it is to be an outsider in Rowan. You can see what is happening. You can see that it works. The reasons it works are written in a language that takes a lifetime of psychic development to read fluently, and you do not have that lifetime, and the city is not particularly interested in translating. What it has built, the community inside Rowan's walls, is the most cohesive I have encountered in 40 years of travel. Not in the forced cohesion way of communities built on exclusion, though there is that too, and I am coming to it, but in the genuine way of people who have known each other at a depth that most human relationships do not reach, who have built mutual obligation into the literal economy of their daily lives, who grieve together in light because they have always grieved together, and because this is what they know how to do. The institutions are extraordinary. The conservatory is the finest center of psychic research in the known world. The Temple of the Open Mind offers things that cannot be found elsewhere, and offers some of them for free to anyone who walks through the door. The creature management operation protects a region that could not protect itself. The animal training program produces the best disciplined working animals in the Flaking Realms, and does so in a way that is, by every account I can gather, genuinely kind to the animals involved. The silence is real, and it is beautiful. The light shows are real, and they are the most affecting thing I have seen in 40 years of travel. The tea at the covered lantern is real, and I intend to go back for it. What it has done. 147 children, on average, every year. That is the number that I come back to. Not because it is the largest harm Rowan has produced. The systematic exclusion of common folk from meaningful participation in a city that was partly built on their ancestors' survival is a larger harm by any quantitative measure. Not because it is the most philosophically troubling. The deliberation circle's structural exclusion of non-psychic voices from the voting mechanism is more insidious in its invisibility, but because it is the most concrete. 147 children sent through a portal into creature territory who do not come back, every year, for decades, in a city with the tools to stop it. The Blooming Party has governed this city for over a century, and in that time has produced genuine prosperity, genuine safety, and genuine harm. The harm is not incidental to the prosperity. It is partly constitutive of it. The demographic uniformity that makes the city's psychic community function as it does has been maintained, in part, through the elimination of those who did not fit it. The safety that residents experience is real, and it is built on the insecurity of the people who were removed to create it. This is not a unique feature of Rowan. It is the standard architecture of most societies that have achieved something worth having. Row, and is unusual only in that the acknowledgement is harder to avoid when the community is psychically transparent, and the harm is visibly present alongside the beauty, rather than hidden in a history that has been curated to omit it. Whether it can chain. The Together Party exists. This is the most hopeful thing I can say about Rowan's political future, and I want to say it plainly before I say the less hopeful things. The Together Party exists, and it has representatives in the deliberation circle, and some of those representatives are people of genuine ability and genuine conviction who have looked at what the city does and found it insufficient. They are politically marginal. They are consistently read as emotionally dangerous before they approach the center platform. They are working against a system that has been entrenching itself for over a century. The conservatory has the tools to change the testing protocol. The research exists. The alternatives are documented. Someone with the political will to implement them and the standing to survive the attempt could do it. I do not currently see that person in the council. I note the possibility because possibilities matter. The patron situation is the thing I cannot assess clearly because I do not have all the information I would need to assess it. What I know is that something in the plains has an interest in the city's continued practice of sending children into them, and that this interest has been operating long enough to be patient about it. I am watching. I have left lines of contact open. If I learn something worth saying, I will say it in a subsequent volume. What it is for. Rowan is a city for psychics. I want to say this as plainly and as completely as I can say anything, which is to say without softening and without the implication that it ought to be otherwise. It is not made for common folk. It does not pretend to be made for common folk. The bare minimum it does to accommodate them is precisely calibrated to the bare minimum, enough to maintain the trade relationships and the specialist access the city needs, not enough to suggest that their presence is valued beyond those functions. Travelers can visit Rowan. Travelers can find it beautiful and disorienting and affecting and strange and worth the journey. Travelers can purchase items from the conservatory and seek healing from the temple and sit in the Stillwater sanctum and eat the fruit and drink the tea and watch the lights when someone passes and come away having encountered something genuinely unlike anything else in the Flaking Realms. The city will permit all of this with the composed tolerance of a place that understands its own value and has no particular need to advertise it. What travelers cannot do is belong there. The belonging is not available to people who were not shaped by the same conditions that shape the city, and the city is honest enough to make this visible in ways that most cities that do not want you manage to obscure. Most cities offer the performance of welcome and deliver the reality of tolerance and call it hospitality. Row and delivers the reality of tolerance and does not bother with the performance. This is, depending on your relationship with honesty, either refreshing or bleak. I found it both. I find most true things both. Chapter 28. An unfinished note. This book is done. The story is not. The 4 people whose memories are sharpening have each written to me since I began composing this volume. The impressions are becoming clearer. One of them described, in their most recent letter, a specific quality of presence, patient, attentive, genuinely interested in them, that they are beginning to remember from the plains. Not threatening. Something that found them in the worst moment of their lives and stayed with them through it and offered them a way home. They are writing about it with a complicated warmth that I understand and that I am watching carefully. I have not told them what I believe that warmth is directed toward. I am still making the calculation described in the interlude. I am doing so with the awareness that the calculation cannot be held indefinitely, and that at some point the kindness of withholding and the harm of withholding will exchange places, and I will need to have something ready to say. I am working on what to say. This volume will be in circulation before I have finished working on it. The patron question is the thread I am pulling in the next phase of this research, and it connects, I believe, to things I have observed in other city-states across the Flaking Realms that I have not yet had cause to examine directly. The consistency of the curse of artifice, the regularity with which societies that pursue mechanical creation encounter catastrophic interruption. The specific quality of the interruption in each case, varied enough to seem natural, consistent enough, to someone who has looked at enough of them to seem otherwise. I am going to look at more of them. I am going to write about what I find. What remains? The Flaking Realms volume has more entries still to write. The world is very large. I have been moving through it for 40 years and I have covered less of it than I would like, which is partly a function of how large it is and partly a function of how thoroughly I tend to cover the parts I do reach. Row, and took 2 months the second time. It took 3 weeks to write. It has taken, if I am honest, considerably longer than that to think about, and I am not certain I am finished thinking about it. I expect I will return. There are things I want to follow up on. There is tea I want to drink again. There is a flower-born district that I observed briefly and incompletely, and whose light shows I would like to see again from inside them, having now seen enough of the person whose life one of them commemorated to understand something of what the images meant. There is a hermit in the forest who told me to leave, and who I hope is well. A note before closing. Rowan, the history. A civilization survived its own destruction through alliance, adaptation, and 48 years of war conducted entirely in silence. The people, flower-born who live 30 years and spend them completely, mixed who built the city their ancestors imagined, common folk who perform belonging in a space not made for them with the particular exhaustion of people who have decided the cost is worth paying. The politics, a party that has governed for a century by making the status quo feel like common sense, an opposition that cannot be calm enough to be heard, a moderate party that does the economic work quietly while everyone argues about the social questions. The places, a conservatory that leads the world in understanding what a mind is and how it works. A temple that heals things that cannot be healed elsewhere and maintains a door to arborea for the people patient enough to use it carefully. An inn run by people who believe in something and make room for people who need a place to set it down. A district that has built its grief into light. The plains, creatures that should not exist in the numbers they exist in, moving with the patience of things that were made rather than evolved. Children sent into them annually, 3 returning. Something in the plains that has an interest in the ones who survive. A system that the city has the tools to change and has not changed. A patron whose full nature I am not publishing and whose presence I am nomming anyway, because nomming it is the minimum the situation requires. The verdict, beautiful for visitors, consistent for its residents, harsh to those who do not belong. A city for psychics that does not pretend otherwise, which is a kind of honesty most cities cannot manage, and which makes its other qualities of honesty and its particular cruelties sit in the same unedited frame. You can observe it. You cannot belong to it unless you were shaped by the same things that shaped it. It is not trying to change this, and it is not sorry about it, and it is, in this specific way, more honest than most of the world. Go carefully. Go quietly. Listen more than you speak. And if you find yourself in the covered lantern with a warm cup in your hands and 2 months of complicated feelings about a city that has shown you exactly what it is, sit with it. That is what the city is for in the end. Not for you. But it will show you something true about yourself if you let it, and that is more than most places manage. The information is out there. Go find it. Glorious knowledge seeker. Somewhere in the Flaking Realms. Precise location withheld, for the usual reasons. Rowan, a complete account. Being the 7th volume of an honest accounting of the Flaking Realms. By Glorious Knowledge Seeker.